There are a lot of assumptions made by a lot of people about the history of the earth around us.
And everyone knows when you make an assumption, you make an ass out of you and umption.
It's a good thing this Bible documentary won't be making any assumptions.
The Bible that assumes that it's true.
The Bible records historical events. The passage that talks about the creation of Adam and Eve. You're seeing that as a clear historical event.
Oh, absolutely. In fact, the first thing is that it's an accurate historical account.
If you know anything about the history of science, you know it's an incredibly unreliable path.
We need to interpret the universe in terms of Genesis, not the other way around.
Yikes.
Kind of a challenge I would have to anybody who watches the Is Genesis History movie. When one side presents their argument, it sounds compelling until somebody comes and cross-examines them.
Back in 2017, when this channel had barely begun, a film was unleashed upon theaters, asking the question,
Is Genesis history?
On its opening night, the film attracted over 140,000 viewers, earning $1.8 million, which was the highest of any film in theaters in the United States on that particular evening, beating out Lego Batman. Alas, the movie did not play in my home country of Canada, but with all the major creation ministries promoting it so much, I decided to enlist fellow science-embracing YouTuber SciStrike to brave the New Jersey crowds, to see it on my behalf, and take copious notes so that we could co-create a video series we called Is Genesis History Science? In the years since, the movie has earned over $3 million in theaters and even more in DVD sales, has spun off a bit of its own Is Genesis History cinematic universe with a sequel, hundreds of ancillary videos, and study curriculum for church and school use. More recently, the full movie was put on YouTube for free, where it has been watched over 5 million times. That's a rather one-sided conversation, so I wanted to blow the dust off our first take at a 13-part series addressing the claims of the film and bring it to you all at once. Sadly, too soon after this, my friend SciStrike passed away suddenly. So rather than re-record the objections, I've remastered the original sound, updated and unified all the visuals, and utilized clips from the film itself rather than the original reenactments from our notes, which was the best we could do at the time. SciStrike, this is for you.
On February 23rd, I put on my best collar and headed off to the Cinemark Hazlitt 12 Theater in Hazlitt, New Jersey, to see Is Genesis History? Having never been there, I was half expecting the Cinemark Hazlitt 12 Theater to be a batch of folding chairs in some church basement. But it turned out to be a real theater, showing real movies. Who knew? I expected to have issues at the ticket booth, even though I had pre-purchased my ticket. The girl behind the register seemed to be trying to elaborate on their no dogs allowed policy. Thinking quickly, I indicated I was a service dog, so she had better not give me any crap, or the theater would have a world of bad press the next day. She countered by asking to whom exactly I was being of service. Me, I said. She shrugged her shoulders and handed me the ticket. All right. Technically, she tucked it into my collar. First things first, I decided. Then off to the theater that was to show Is Genesis History. I was in my seat with my pen and notepad a good 10 minutes before the scheduled start time of 7 p.m. As showtime approached, it seemed the film was destined to bomb as there were only 7 of us in the theater. As often happens with hasty judgments, I was mistaken. As the last few minutes before 7 ticked away, people filed in and every seat was filled. Many of the seats were occupied by children. Children! As luck would have it, the seat directly to my left was occupied by a woman who introduced herself, I have no idea why, as an AIG teacher. Teacher! Did you hear that? An AIG teacher. Seeing my pen and notepad, and seemingly ignorant of the fact that I was trying to pretend that she did not exist, she asked if I was a critic. I replied, woof. She said, God bless you, which thoroughly confused me, but she left me alone for the rest of the show. One last deep dive into the bag of popcorn, and I prepared myself for the feverish scribbling of notes that was to follow. This would be no easy task. Remember the whole no thumbs thing. As the lights dimmed, I thought to myself, okay, let's get this over with.
I first became aware of the Is Genesis History movie when Eric Hoven's Creation Today ministry began to plug it. It was hard to miss. In the weeks before it hit theaters, Eric was doing Facebook Live chats with almost everyone involved in the film, including the host, Del Tackett.
Tell me what in the world made you get involved in a project like this? Is Genesis history?
We chatted together. He had an idea of being able to just bring the scientific evidence in the field with the scientists who are doing that work to try to help people be reassured that there is scientific evidence that supports a historical reading of Genesis.
And there you have it, right from Del's mouth. The purpose of the movie is to reassure those who already believe. It is not to convince a skeptic or even prove anything to an existing believer. The movie is to be reassuring, comfortable, unchallenging, a warm blanket, a hug, and a cup of cocoa. But we're here to look at the actual claims made, not the platitudes or warm fuzzies. Do they hold up? What is the evidence? What do other experts say? If you care about the truth, you owe it to yourself to examine in full, which is what we'll do here. Let's get started. The film opens with host Del Tackett meandering in unspecified, rugged-looking country of mountains, lakes, meadows, and streams. Planting a seed for the audience, he says the area reminds him of the Grand Canyon, and ponders how long it might have taken for the features around him to form. And then, Del throws out the movie's very first scientific claim, and the first attempt to undermine the scientific method.
A lot of these rocks have been dated to be 350,000 years old, up to 2 million. That's pretty old. But it might surprise you to know that all of the geological formations that we see here, the canyons, the layers, even the plants, are younger than I am.
Dun dun dun. We're just 2 minutes in and Del has pulled his first switcheroo, the first devastating blow to naturalistic paradigm and the imagined expectations of the audience. He's actually standing near the foot of Mount St. Helens, a volcano that erupted in 1980, a place where the most recent features are well documented as forming only 37 years ago. And yet, someone somehow dated these rocks to be at least 350,000 years old. How could you trust such a person or the science they represent? Well, let's take a look at who this poor scientist was who obviously got the dates so very, very wrong. It seems to be one Steve Austin. No, not that Steve Austin. No, not that Steve Austin. Steve A. Austin, from the Institute for Creation Research, and coincidentally, the very first PhD who will be trotted out by the movie. It seems that in the late 80s, Dr. Steve Austin and his associates gathered up some samples from Mount St. Helens, did his own undocumented sorting of the materials, then submitted them for potassium-40 argon dating. The lab returned results with drastically wrong dates of 350,000 years and older. Austin has been promoting this finding for decades to attempt to undermine the accuracy of radiometric dating. As a refresher, radiometric dating utilizes the features of radioactive material that it decays at a very constant, precisely measurable rate. This is the principle upon which we use atomic clocks, for example. Since we know the half-life, the amount of time needed for half the sample to decay, we can measure the ratio of parent material to daughter material and can calculate a time. The trouble is, with potassium-40's half-life of over 1.2 million years, Austin basically attempted to measure the distance between a sandwich and a pickle on his plate using a satellite in space, then laughing when the result came back within 2 meters. It's the wrong tool for the wrong job. There are very few labs in the world that have the kind of expensive precision equipment to accurately measure argon-40 quantities as small as a few thousand years, let alone a few dozen years. One such laboratory is not Geochron Laboratories of Cambridge, Massachusetts, where Austin sent his samples. In fact, the lab no longer even performs potassium-40 dating. But if we go back to the earliest times of the Internet Wayback Machine, when they did process such samples, we can see that the lab clearly states we cannot analyze samples expected to be less than 2 million years old. Del hired someone who warned him in advance that they didn't have the right tools for the job, then got excited when they didn't have the right tools for the job. After spraying this gotcha on the audience, Del says,
Isn't it amazing what a little bit of information from the past can do to help change your view of the present and the present world around you?
That is amazing. Here's a bit more information. The obvious dating incompetence presented was purported by the so-called expert we're going to see on screen. Either the producers didn't know this, when they should have, or they knew about it and decided to misrepresent the findings on purpose. Does that little bit of information help the audience change their view about what they're about to see? I'm not even going to go into the other obvious fallacies involved in comparing Mount St. Helens to the Grand Canyon, including the materials of soft ash versus solid limestone, the slope and grade of the walls, the factor of 100,000 times difference in size, etc. We're only one claim in, and we already have one very dishonest misrepresentation of a fact. Where will the movie go from here?
Look at this canyon. It reminds me of the Grand Canyon. You got this little stream, you got these steep canyon walls. How long do you suppose it would take for a stream this small to remove this much material and cut the canyon this deep? But it might surprise you to know that all of the geological formations that we see here, the canyons, the layers, even the plants, are younger than I am. When I was born, there was nothing here but a vast forest, hundreds of feet below where we're standing right now. In fact, before 1980, most people had never even heard of Mount St. Helens.
Dell is babbling about Mount St. Helens, which brings in the interbedded volcanic ash issue he and other YECers normally steer clear of. RJ, any views on this?
The sediments on Mount St. Helens were unconsolidated volcanic ash, which is easily eroded. The Grand Canyon was carved into harder materials, including well-consolidated sandstone and limestone, hard metamorphosed sediments, plus a touch of relatively recent basalt.
So you're saying that the two canyons are cut into different materials, so it's not really fair to compare the two. Is that what you're saying?
Well, yes, but that's not the only reason. The walls of the Mount St. Helens Canyon slope 45 degrees, whereas the walls of the Grand Canyon are vertical in places. The streams flowing down Mount St. Helens flow at a steeper grade than the Colorado River does, allowing for greater erosion. Additionally, the Grand Canyon is more than 100,000 times larger than the canyon on Mount St. Helens. For these reasons alone, the two are not at all comparable.
Did God create the world in a few days?
Nope.
Or billions of years? Is mankind descended from apes? Or did God create us instantly?
Just stop it. No or. Humans are apes, jackass.
Was there a global flood that destroyed the earth?
No, that's just a story. And it's a stolen story.
Is Genesis history?
You're seriously asking us that?
I'd heard of a scientist who had spent over 40 years studying this question.
That would be Stephen Austin, PhD, geologist. His claimed area of expertise is sedimentary geology. He's going to tell us about the layers of sediment laid down by the alleged global flood.
And we kind of have a layer cake here, don't we, of strata that have been eroded for our benefit to see the inside structure of the Earth. These same layers are also in Colorado. We're also in Illinois, also in Pennsylvania. So the lowest layers are formed first. Those are sediment grains that were mixed, separated, and flowed in here from different directions and accumulated one on top of another. And then, of course, naturally, they convert to rock.
Naturally, they convert to rock, Stevie Boy casually says, avoiding that annoying little issue of how long that takes and whether any flood event could change or speed that up.
So you're saying that the solid ground we're standing on right now, if we went back in its history, it'd be liquid?
Yes.
What do you think, RJ? Liquid rock?
Liquid? Something like a thin milkshake? The particles come from a landscape brought by water and are deposited, dropped, precipitated out. It varies and can be observed in current geology and experiments. So already terminology is being used to prepare the viewer to accept the sloshy land of flood. And let's not forget some of the world's geology deposits are aeolian, wind-blown, not waterborne. Experiments also show why those forms look different in the sediments, as distinctive as the weave of a cloth. And what's with the traipsing off to far-flung poster spots like the Grand Canyon instead of trying to explain the geology under their feet at home? After all, if the flood were global, they could see it wherever they lived. No vacation required.
The 4,000 feet of flat-lying strata in the canyon are flat. And relative to one another, we look in between the strata layers and we don't see the passage of time in between layers.
You mean erosion?
Erosion, especially, and channeling on any great scale is not visible. And then we look at the strata themselves and they provide evidence of rapid, very rapid sedimentation. Just minutes or hours is all that's needed to make layers.
Preserved in the Cambrian Tapeats, Bright Angel, and Muab formations are bands of marine fossils. These are not only chronicled a very gradual rise in sea level, they remained in parallel when the rocks were subsequently tilted. Geologist Arthur Strahler considered this configuration the coup de grace for the deluge theory of the Grand Canyon. For to bring this set about meant having the floodwaters lay down a repeated sequence of parallel chevrons. It would be the equivalent of having a mudslide sweep through a tea shop and knocking over all the furniture, but ending up with every cup still in its saucer, fixed in place on the tip tablecloths. It would have been genuinely fascinating to read a flood geology explanation for so unusual an arrangement, but this was one aspect of Grand Canyon stratigraphy that did not come up in Austin's book.
My understanding is the ocean floor upheaval occurred.
Well, his understanding is wrong then, as nothing oceanic about the deposits is noted, but instead gentle seacoasts. A giant surge of water would wash those details away, not make them.
So that's why we get these marine fossils in these layers.
RJ, I know you have something to say about that.
Marine fossils in layers? Oh, Stevie boy, then why not advanced fish or plesiosaurs or orcas and advanced foraminifera, which we get in droves in later deposits? Everything in the fossil record had to be contemporary, and no YECer, least of all Smiley Face Austin, has got within 900 miles of explaining the selectivity and specificity of the fauna in the Grand Canyon, or anywhere else for that matter. That's called biogeography and taphonomy, if you'd like to know the scientific subdisciplines that delve into those things and which anti-EVOs generally, and YECers specifically, operate very far away from. Foraminiferous silicate casings are nearly indestructible, which is why the record of them is so nice and evolutionary.
We have 6 months the waters prevailed upon the earth, another 7 months or so for the water to subside.
6 months water prevailed, 7 months to subside, huh? Nice.
And how exactly did that cause the loose sediment to turn into rock almost instantly? Any science experiments to back that up, Steve? Or is that yet another baseless assertion? Alas, been waiting through decades of creationist apologetics for that little detail to be divulged.
And that represents the later stages of the flood and the retreat of the floodwater. This surface was beveled by retreat of floodwaters. And as the flood retreated into the newly formed ocean basins, then the continents probably uplifted.
The continents probably uplifted because of retreating water. Got any demonstrable mechanism for that? Anyone? Bueller?
And the Ark, of course, was landed in the high country.
The Ark landed in the high country? So how come they got dry rock to land on? How come that spot of unreal estate managed not to be a glop of congealing, maybe not yet rock, like what must have been occurring in the Grand Canyon? The need to have the strata and the canyon formed in the flood puts you in a weird bind, Stevie boy. Now, flood apologists invoke a lake flooding upstream after the main waters subsided to do the canyon carving, but that still crimps their timings, as they must have the rocks harden in uber-quick mode in order to allow the after-flood to cut a canyon in it. Oops.
I believe it's a global flood, and all the high hills or the whole heaven were covered, a universal statement, but that mountains have risen since then.
Stevie boy, put this on your to-do list. Figure out in detail how the hell all the known big bumpy mountain ranges poked up, again in super fast fashion, post-2500 BCE, before they had a chance to be noticed by the natives who didn't see any excessive bumpiness happening on their watch. Never mind that we can measure mountain uplift and plate movements these days with millimeter accuracy. And by the way, if flood geology with its crashing funhouse continents is so correct, how come not a single oil company on Earth uses flood geology to find oil? Nope. They rely on the standard geological system and literally get returns on their investment in science. Don't plan on getting rich anytime soon with the Answers in Genesis oil drilling startup.
Well, it was the story that we all learned in grammar school. Okay, Colorado River, over tens of millions of years, cut the Grand Canyon. Most geologists have jettisoned that idea.
Most geologists have jettisoned the river formation of Grand Canyon? Oh, really? Care to name a few of those most geologists, Steve? I don't know of any, let alone most. Gonna have to call bullshit here.
You can't imagine a canyon enduring that long with erosion.
Is that because it would have eventually the sides would have collapsed and broken down?
What the hell? The nested V-shaped canyons are exactly what slowly forming canyons do when the height differential between headwaters and end outflow is increasing faster than the erosion.
It can be due to a rise in the landmass at the upper end, as in the case of the Grand Canyon, or because the outflow body lowered. This happened some millions of years ago when the Mediterranean dried up, causing the Nile to carve an incised canyon, which had since filled in from sediment after the Gibraltar plug broke and the Mediterranean rose again. This canyon was discovered by soundings conducted to build the foundations for the Aswan High Dam.
Then how in the world do we get this all carved out?
Well, there are lots of theories, and personally, I like the idea of catastrophic erosion by drainage of lakes.
As expected, Austin mentions his favorite, the catastrophic draining of hypothetical post-flood lakes.
Austin likes to use the Spokane flood as a model for rapid erosion, but he omits such details as the waters racing along at up to 75 feet per second, noted in John Allen's classic 1986 book. Austin had set a ceiling rate of 5 feet per second on the high-velocity flow he proposed for the Coconino sandstone dunes. Austin also relied on Leonard Brand, a creationist biologist at Loma Linda University, for the claim that tracks of a Permian proto-mammal preserved there were made underwater. Criticism of Brand by fossil track expert Martin Lockley characterized the flood theory of the Coconino dunes as geologically naive and disingenuous.
For those of you that are interested, I've included a link in the description that explains this in much greater detail than we have time for now. It's titled Letters to Creationists, and I hope you enjoy it.
And how long would it take to erode Grand Canyon? Maybe weeks, but not millions of years. Time is not a magic wand that solves all the geologic problems of the world.
Austin claims weeks, not millions of years, could have formed the Grand Canyon. Time is not a magic wand, he says, but neither is a flood event that could not have produced what we see. To carry off that much sediment would have involved water flow as grand as Missoula flooding, but they carved steep-walled canyons, not V-shaped nested ones. Links to details of this kind of flooding are also included in the description, listed as Ice Age floods.
And Austin is still begging the question, how did the prior flood slurry turn into rock fast enough not to be washed away, as thoroughly as a garden hose cleans your driveway of a layer of undifferentiated muck?
The boundary between the granite rock below and the Tappete sandstone above is this surface we call the Great Unconformity.
And is it just here?
The Great Unconformity is continent-wide.
Austin insists he finds the Great Unconformity to be continent-wide, indeed global. Perhaps along with finding Waldo and Sasquatch, Austin has spared readers details on these deposits, or how he ascertained they represented the same moment in time that he thinks occurred only 4,500 years ago.
Somehow those pyramid-building Egyptians managed not to notice the Middle Eastern or African flood, as their recorded history straddles that zone in the pyramid-building phase.
The power-moving water was beveling and pulverizing rock, depositing great thicknesses of layers and calling our minds to think about a global flood.
This is more of Austin's wishful thinking. The flood was depositing great thicknesses of rock, but particle settling does depend on the speed and density of the water and the sediment, and just invoking large amounts of water is far more of a magic wand than anything uniformitarian geology ever relies on.
Yeah, make the waters too big and fast, and they don't deposit anything. They erode. Slow it down enough to actually deposit stuff, and you can't get the thickness he wants and turn it all into rock without the application of time. It's the same reason that jacking up the temperature of your oven to 4,500 degrees won't cut the time of baking your cake by 90%. It will just produce a charred cinder.
The conventional story is entirely different, though. It would say that there is a lot of time between each of these layers.
That's right. You can make rock from sediment in a week or a month or, screw it. I've had enough of this babble. You all get the idea.
Blown away by the geological mysteries Dell has just seen and not understood, he retreats to an area he thinks he does understand, computer science. But none of these newfangled tablets or mice or even color screens. No. Dell feels more at home at the Computer History Museum, where he attempts to relate this technology graveyard to the film's narrative that science changes and is therefore somehow unreliable.
As we looked at the exhibit, I was reminded how much smaller and more powerful computers have become since I first started using them. Paul said our changing assumptions about computers were really a series of paradigm shifts.
Perhaps to a layperson, this seems like a good example of an unstable science. After all, computers sure seem to have changed a lot since the Turing machine back in the 1930s. From the size of a room to fitting in your pocket. It seems like every year new models of computers and phones make last year's models obsolete. The pace is relentless, and the average viewer can definitely relate. There's even Moore's law that postulates that the number of transistors that can fit on a computer chip will double every 2 years, though this seems to be slowing down. But I, too, am a computer scientist, Del, and your example here doesn't hold up. Sure, there have been massive breakthroughs in hardware, software, and user interface, but a series of paradigm shifts? No. The foundational computer science of a state machine pushing ones and zeros through and OR gates is the same as it's always been. It's all just smaller now. Maybe quantum computing will give us a paradigm shift someday, but for now, the illusion that computer science is rethinking everything from the ground up on a regular basis is nonsense. And here's the problem with this movie that you're going to hear over and over. The credentials of the men on screen and the sciencey sounding words cleverly edited together are going to sound assuring to anyone with only a passing interest in the science. But when the film takes on an area where the viewer is an expert, like I am with computers, the flaws in the presentation are glaring, and that dishonesty makes you question the foundation of any of it. I'm not the only one who thinks this. For example, Christian astrophysicist Dr. Jeff Zwernick said this about the film.
One parallel experience I've had is, I'm sitting there in the movie theater watching and listening to some of the geologists and the paleontologists, people who I don't have any expertise. I kind of largely have to listen to what people say because it's not my training. And I'm put in this conundrum of thinking this doesn't sound right, but I don't know the details to get around it, or don't know the details to respond to it. When one side presents their argument, it sounds compelling until somebody comes and cross-examines them. And I found that in the story given by the astronomer in the movie, where he's talking about how, spirals shouldn't exist in galaxies. I'm like, I know how that's not a problem. And he was talking about distant light and how it's created. It's like, no, that poses problems. And where I saw the weakness of his arguments, it said, all right, I'm a little skeptical of all the other arguments at this point, because where he spoke to what I know, he didn't build his credibility, in my opinion.
The purpose of this scene at the Computer Museum is to establish the two paradigms that are touted at the top of the Is Genesis History movie poster. Dell's entire premise is to contrast his interpretation of the Bible, where God created the 6,000-year-old universe in 6 literal days, versus every other origin position possible. If he is successful in setting up this dichotomy, Dell's experts can attempt to poke holes in naturalistic theories, and his audience will count that in the proof column for the young Earth creation. Of course, that's ridiculous. The theory of evolution could be proven completely wrong tomorrow, and that wouldn't lend a shred of evidence to the claim of creation. These ideas may be in conflict, but they're not the only possibilities. Each one needs to be evaluated separately with its own evidence. With that in mind, Dell talks to Paul A. Nelson, second up in the film's parade of PhDs. They don't mention it, but Nelson's doctorate isn't in science, it's in philosophy. While there's probably no need to go as far as Dr. Stephen Hawking is to declare that philosophy is dead in the light of physics, I'll perhaps quote the Nobel Prize-winning physicist Richard Feynman, who said, "Philosophy of science is about as useful to scientists as ornithology is to birds."
So really, to understand this question of origins, you really need to begin by looking at the governing paradigms, the two major views that we currently have about the history of life and the history of the universe.
Now, ordinarily, I would need to do a deep dive into the claims being put forth to see what the best minds on all sides of the issue have to say and bring that to you as a counterpoint to the expert. But the day Is Genesis History came out in theaters, the strangest thing happened. Paul Nelson, the very man Dell is interviewing right now, published this article refuting his own words and the very foundation of the entire Is Genesis History movie. So, if it pleases the viewer, I'm going to defer to Dr. Nelson's own words from his blog entry entitled, "New Film Is Genesis History Presents a False Dichotomy. I dissent from my role in it." I am interviewed as saying that the origins debate is a choice between two paradigms, the conventional paradigm and the historical Genesis paradigm. However, as Is Genesis History defines these two positions, the dichotomy places together what are actually fundamentally different viewpoints. To put the matter as plainly as possible, what I say about only two paradigms is not true. After seeing the film's advertising and promotional materials, I became concerned about the false dichotomy and sent a detailed 2,100-word memo to Compass Cinema, asking that my interview segment be modified by adding narration. In my interview segment of Is Genesis History, which occurs about 13 minutes into the film, I introduced Thomas Kuhn's famous concept of a paradigm, described as a framework within which evidence is interpreted. I then characterized two competing paradigms concerning origins, the conventional paradigm versus the historical genesis paradigm. The conventional paradigm includes deep time, i.e., the standard 13.7 billion year history of the universe, with an Earth forming at about 4.6 billion years ago, and life and animals originating later. And all the complexity of life constructed by strictly physical processes with no intelligent design involved. This "and" in Is Genesis History's definition of the conventional paradigm brings together acceptance of a long timescale with an assertion of no design, thereby creating the false dichotomy. Scholars and scientists see unmistakable evidence of design in biology and the universe, but also accept the standard 13.7 billion year timescale. These persons would vigorously deny that their positions are accurately represented by either the conventional paradigm or the historical Genesis paradigm as defined by His Genesis History. So, if the very man who appears in the film to present the paradigm premise foundation upon which the entire movie stands felt so compelled as to publicly denounce his role and the ideas presented, how much should you accept it? What does this say about the claims of the rest of the film? The producers of the film knew about this in advance and put out the film anyhow. Is knowingly breaking the 9th commandment acceptable as long as the lies are meant to forward a specific interpretation of the Bible? Next up in the Is Genesis History parade of PhDs was Steve Boyd, a Hebraist, who was there to speak to the linguistic clues in the early chapters of Genesis. As tends to be, the central debate is the meaning of Yom, translated as day in most English Bibles, and its meaning. Unsurprisingly, Boyd feels this can be interpreted in no manner other than 24 hours, despite legions of scholars who disagree, or are at least less certain. But as nothing Boyd discusses was a scientific claim, and this is Genesis History Science, let's skip ahead to the next on the roster. Dr. Andrew Snelling of Sydney, Australia, currently in the employ of Answers in Genesis representing the field of geology. Andrew took Dell to SP Crater, a cinder cone volcano near Flagstaff, Arizona. As visually impressive as the crater is, Andrew pointed out that this is a relatively small volcano in historical context. He speaks of Mount St. Helens eruption in 1980, which was 2,500 times smaller than the Yellowstone eruption, estimated to be 630,000 years ago, by the way, which in turn was a fraction of the size of the largest known volcanic eruption of the Deccan Traps in India, about 65 million years ago. Using these three data points, Snelling concludes,
what we see in the present is really only minuscule by comparison to what we've seen in the past.
There are currently around 1,500 of what are considered to be active volcanoes in the world, with about 50 or so erupting each year. Even if we limit ourselves to 6,000 years of history, that's 300,000 eruptions to consider. And Andrew cherry-picked 3 examples to infer a trend that volcanic activity is not only trending downward, but that it is reducing by orders of magnitude. In fact, the trend lines over time for volcanic activity are relatively flat and stable, even over relatively short periods of time. What we do see are spikes in frequency and spikes in severity, just as one would expect in a relatively random event like volcanoes. Small eruptions happen all the time. Big eruptions happen all the time.
And that's telling us something about the historic past. We can't use present-day rates of these processes to understand how quickly and how majestically, in terms of scale, the geological record accumulated.
Andrew is inferring that somehow because volcanic activity isn't consistent enough to be considered a clock, that somehow no clock could possibly exist. This is like saying that because the amount of rainfall varies from year to year, that we have no way of knowing how long it takes the Earth to orbit the Sun. Because some days I drink more coffee than other days, no one can predict when the 6 o'clock news will be on. Demonstrating an unpredictable event in no way rules out predictable events. Some things happen at constant rates, some things happen at variable rates. Actually, Andrew would disagree with that, but we'll get to that in a minute. Finally, Dell asks the big question.
How do we determine the age of these rocks?
To my surprise, Andrew answers with the high-level, but relatively accurate description of radiometric dating. Radioactive elements in volcanic rock begin to decay to daughter products, and by using the slow rate of this conversion, rocks can be dated to millions of years old.
The fact that the decay rates in the present are slow.
In the present? That's strange phrasing.
But we would say that the present is not really the key to the past because obviously the past holds some massive, massive catastrophic events that are not going on today.
Wait, what? What catastrophe could possibly affect the rate that radioactive elements decay? Those rates have been rigorously tested to be unaffected by temperature, pressure, moisture, electrical or magnetic fields, or any other external pressures. For the sake of being complete, a relatively rare process of electron capture can affect the rate, but by less than 1%. Decay rates are literally clockwork. Perhaps you've heard of the atomic clock? The one major catastrophe a young Earth creationist proposes is a worldwide flood. But what aspect of a year-long flood could possibly impact decay rates? Again, the most extreme temperature, pressure, and moisture conditions have absolutely no impact on radioactive decay. But rather than merely asserting it, let's look at studies like this one of rocks from the Moon, Mars, and meteorite material that hits Earth show that radioactive decay rates are identical on those bodies as they are on Earth. Are we to believe that the catastrophic events of Noah's flood equally impacted bodies in outer space? In fact, Andrew himself wrote an extensive paper on one of these meteorite finds and concluded there is no doubt that the decay rates in space were consistent with the decay rates on Earth. He even says the 4.56 billion year old age is well established, but I think that would be an unfair quote mine. So what are these alleged catastrophes that change the laws of physics? We never find out.
In fact, the Bible would say that the past is the key to the present. If you want to understand why the way the world is today, you've got to understand what happened in the past.
Now, I know I said earlier that our series is focused solely on the movie's science claims and not the theological ones. But given this claim, I'd be remiss to not point out that there's a list of verses, including Jeremiah 33:25, where God says he fixed the laws for the sky and earth, that most theologians point to as biblical evidence that the laws of nature have never changed.
So we've got lots of hints that geological processes haven't been at constant rates through time, and we have other hints that the decay rates may not have been constant.
Hints is an interesting choice of words. Hints that decay rates may not have been constant is quite different from evidence that they were different. But if hints are all we have, what are these hints? Variation in the rates of volcanoes exploding was inexplicably talked about, but never connected to decay rates. I took to Andrew's scholarship to find out more about these hints, but all I could find was this 2009 article with a single example of a single sample where two radiometric methods came up with radically different dates. It sounded like he had more lines of evidence, but since not.
What we've done is we've submitted the same samples to more than one of these dating methods. And so what we found is on the same samples with more than one method, we were getting ages that were different by hundreds of millions of years or even a billion years in some instances.
I looked up Andrew's paper on this experiment, and by paper, I mean a relatively short article on the ICR website. It's basically a retelling of Stephen A. Austin's 1992 article. You'll remember Austin from our introductory episode as the one who deliberately used dating equipment known to be imprecise to try to prove imprecision. I wonder if he'll do something like that again. Now, Austin's article compares the rubidium-strontium dating of some Grand Canyon samples with what's called the isochron dating method for the same samples. Now, isochron dating is unique among radiometric dating techniques in that it requires measurements to be taken from several different objects, and those objects must have all formed at the same time from a common pool of materials. Interestingly, in 1988, 4 years before the study in question, Austin published this article, which demonstrated that he was aware that the lava flows from which he eventually took his samples fell into two different stratigraphic changes, and as such were not from the common pool of material nor formed at the same time. His 1988 article even describes this false isochron effect in relation to other Grand Canyon samples, so he was well aware of it. Now, if radiometric dating methods are so inaccurate, why deliberately select such samples?
We're seeing huge differences by using different methods.
It is the undeniable convergence of common answers from properly applied dating methods that has us convinced that these things are reliable.
Well, if there is that kind of a difference between all of these dating methods, then that would seem to confirm the fact that we have an open system here, not
Correct.
a closed one.
And if we have an open system, that means we can't trust it to give us dependable dates.
For clarification, when Andrew talks about an open system in this context, he means that parent or daughter isotopes could potentially have been added or removed from the sample. In a closed system, like a laboratory, we'd be very sure that there were no contamination or loss. Of course, this is no gotcha, and not news to those who perform radiometric dating procedures. Geochronologists know that there are no closed systems outside of a laboratory, and they take great pains to minimize the dangers of contamination, with procedures improving over time. Best results come when multiple samples are used, when well-known contamination markers are absent, and when multiple methods provide tight conversions. Ironically, it is complete disregard for these procedures that we explored in the introductory episode of Is Genesis History Science, and what Andrew is repeating here.
And that changes the whole thinking about the history of the Earth.
Having gone on the record asserting the radiometric decay rates were different in the past without offering any mechanism for this, evidence for it, not even a Bible verse to support the idea, Andrew takes stealth south of Sedona for what he promises is evidence of a young Earth transformed by a global catastrophe. For several minutes, the film showcases the views, while the men speak in hushed, majestic tones about the size and scales meant to put the viewer in awe. As they probably should be. It's amazing.
It's almost hard to imagine the volume of material that represents.
Of course, scale says nothing about the process, so let's just enjoy the view.
It's like a stack of pancakes.
Pancakes. Andrew points out what he calls the knife edge boundary, the seemingly seamless edges between layers, which isn't actually a consistent thing with well-known crumbling and upheaval in many parts. But I've never really even been sure why this should be a convincing argument. If you've ever made a parfait, you know that the most recently added layer will fill in seamlessly over the layer below, no matter how irregular. And a side view will always look perfectly fitted regardless of slopes and angles and volume.
There's no evidence of erosion there, which means that the Hermit Formation was rapidly deposited, and then immediately the Coconino was a deposit on top of it.
Why would it have to be immediate? In our parfait example, one could add the next layer immediately, or hours, or days, or weeks later. It's the exact same effect. The top layer is fresh and fills in the cracks of what's below. The film then grinds to an oddly specific halt to talk about one of the Grand Canyon layers, known as the Coconino Sandstone, and the comparative angle of cross-bedding effect on land or underwater. Cross-bedding creates the diagonal lines we see, but why are we talking about this? According to Andrew's own ICR website, standard thinking cites the Coconino Sandstone as perhaps the most difficult formation to reconcile with the flood model of Earth history. The conventional view is that the Coconino Sandstone represents ancient wind-blown desert sand dunes, which would have been impossible to form during the global flood.
Dr. John Whitmore has combed the hills around here with his students, hundreds and hundreds of measurements of these crossbeds, and they all come in the range of 15 to 25 degrees. So it was underwater deposition.
Naturally, I looked for Dr. Whitmore's study. It turns out the results were never put into a paper, but were presented once at a conference. His team took 216 measurements. Is that hundreds and hundreds? A table of the measurements has not been shared, but Whitmore claims a mean of 20 degrees, but admits a range as high as 32 degrees. So at very least, Andrew is lying that they all came in under 25 degrees. Why is that important? The angle ranges for land and water indicate the maximum angles for such dunes to exist before collapsing upon themselves. Of course, some dunes will collapse sooner and therefore have a lower angle. The presence of even one reaching 32 degrees, as admitted by Whitmore, indicates that they had to be on dry land, as that's well above the maximum ever found underwater. Of course, the literal textbook on this subject, and the U.S. Forest Service, claim most of the Coconino crossbedding is steep. We don't even have Whitmore's details to compare the claims. Unfortunate. But the evidence of dry land formation isn't limited to those angle measurements. There's material type and distribution, the unique land-based ripple marks, and, most damagingly, an abundance of clear and distinct fine sand reptilian tracks. Yep, reptile footprints. Since the Coconino layer is relatively high up, under flood geology, it would have to have been formed later in the event. There could have been no land-based reptiles alive to be walking around, underwater, leaving very crisp footprints. Strange that Andrew didn't mention that.
So it isn't a difference in believing in those layers that exist.
Not at all.
It's the difference of time, isn't it?
Nope. The difference is starting with the conclusion.
Once people get locked into that focus, anything outside their field of view that conflicts with that focus is marginalized.
To be intellectually honest, one must look at all the evidence.
But you were saying that this kind of evidence is in the open literature now.
Yes.
That's right. It's not that these vague science claims you make are new to anyone. They're not being dismissed. Everyone knows about them. It's not like these claims were made by Andrew or his team. Some of them are centuries old.
Why is it not making an impact?
Well,
because they've been weighed and considered in light of all the evidence. Cherry-picking a few stray data points and speaking to lay people about them in misleading terms is unlikely to impact those who study these things for a living.
Del starts out this segment by telling us how Kurt Wise took him from place to place, showing him evidence of fossil forests, explaining the rapid formation of coal. It should be noted, however, that nowhere in this segment is there any mention of rapid formation of coal. They end up at the entrance of an old abandoned coal mine. Let's join them, shall we?
This is leftover remains of the Dayton Coal and Iron Company, built about 110 years ago.
Well, what's amazing is if you didn't know that history and if you looked at these rocks, you would think they were very ancient. In fact, if we were in Greece, we might think they're thousands of years old.
Well, lucky for us, we do know its history. Real history, that would be. We know that it was an entrance to a mine owned and operated by the Dayton Coal and Iron Company. It is well documented that the Dayton Coal and Iron Company began operations in 1882, so this structure cannot be older than that. What makes me think there's some false equivocation in our near future?
It's hard to tell just looking at the structure itself.
Yes, it is. That's why we use additional means to establish the age of something. I'm guessing that what you're trying to do here is plant the relatively simple idea that things that look old may not be old in the minds of your credulous viewers, who will not take the next step and inquire if other dating methods are in use.
Well, Kurt, then I need for you to do something, because I know that the conventional paradigm looks back in Earth history, and it's a straight line. A lot of uniform processes and so forth. But the Genesis history is telling us that it's not that uniform.
Whoa, hold on there. The premise of this entire movie is to try and establish that Genesis is history. And the claim you just made is based on Genesis being history. That is a classic example of circular reasoning.
Yeah, that's a good point. In 2 Peter chapter 3, it talks about people in the latter days saying, where's the promise of this coming? For all things continue as they were from the beginning of the creation. That concept that what you see in the present, what's happening right now, what's happening in the creek down below, what is happening in every place on the earth, is the way it's always been. It's always been for all of earth history. The passage goes on to say, for this they are willingly ignorant. They're not just ignorant of these truths, they're purposely rejecting these truths, and it lists the creation and the flood. These are apparently events, according to the Bible, that aren't like the present.
Right.
And the neat thing is, that's what we see here. That cliff isn't actually in place. That cliff belongs about 1,000 feet up. It's slid down to its current location. That's a pretty big boulder.
That's huge. That's
massive. Now what kind of process in the present slides, blocks that big down? This thing continues for a mile.
Okay, first, stating that these are truths does not automatically cause them to become truths. I remind you that it is your goal, not your starting point, to establish that the Bible represents history. As for your large rock, I fail to see how that is related to the preceding claims. Loose sediment may have been eroded from beneath a boulder, or perhaps it had fractured off of an even larger rock. Things like that happened in the past. Things like that happen in the present.
But inside those rocks are yet further evidence of an event before that that's even bigger, even more unlike the present. And then inside those rocks are also fossils of a time period that's very different than the present. So that, according to the claims of Scripture and according to my own experience, you can't use the present to judge the past, to understand the past.
You put forth the existence of fossils as evidence. We'll ignore for now your use of the word further. That things were different in the past. I assume that, since your intended audience has heard the term fossil before, they'll accept without question the assertion that things were different. No doubt, based on that, you expect them to broaden the scope of things were different to include your impossibly compressed time frames for geologic and evolutionary events. Sadly, you're probably making a safe bet there.
But if you go all the way back to the beginning, you realize that the Bible lays out what I would call epochs of Earth history.
Major periods of time.
Just different things happening during each of these epochs, that if you lived in any one of the other epochs, you would never understand the previous epoch, because it's so different. The first one is the creation itself. In 6 days, God created the entire universe. He created the planets and the stars, and he stretched out the universe with his outstretched arm. That's obviously not happening today. He's not creating planets. In fact, at the end of that passage, he says he ended his creation work.
Maybe if I say it in a different way. You're stating that events occurred based on the Bible as your authoritative source. I'd like to once again remind you that your implied goal in making the Is Genesis History movie is to hopefully demonstrate that the Bible, and in particular Genesis, is an authoritative source. Until that is proven, using it as an authoritative source is disingenuous.
Then we move into what I call the Edenian epoch, the period of time when Adam and Eve are in the Garden of Eden. And it's very different than the present. We get the impression from that passage, for example, that Adam and Eve, if they had not sinned, would have lived forever. It's hard to even conceive of human beings living forever. So it's a different world, wildly different. How long it lasts, we don't know, but it suddenly terminated with Adam and Eve eating of the tree of the knowledge good and evil,
rebelling,
and God cursing the creation. He changed the rules in the universe. Now no longer is the sun going to be able to burn forever. No longer are we going to be able to live forever.
Finally, we get to talk about a little science. All right. Unfortunately, the scientific evidence shows that Adam and Eve could not have existed. Genetic data shows no evidence of any human bottleneck as small as 2 people. There are just too many different kinds of genes around for that to be the case. There were several bottlenecks that occurred in our species, but the smallest one is a bottleneck of roughly 10,000 to 15,000 individuals between 50,000 and 100,000 years ago. That's as small a population as our ancestors ever had. This is not the kind of information that Dell and his cohorts would like to hear. Obviously, if Adam and Eve never existed, original sin never existed. And if original sin never existed, almost the entire framework upon which this religion is constructed disappears.
So it's hard for us to even imagine what that would be like, because we only see the laws or...
So you're saying that because we can only see the laws of nature in the present, they must have been different in the past. Classic non sequitur. To date, no creationist, or anyone else, has provided any evidence for this different set of rules you're requiring in your model.
And we wouldn't have come to that conclusion if we didn't have the Word of God.
We didn't have this...
And that's what I think the Word of God has been given to us for.
And there we have it. An unsolicited admission that the conclusions in this segment are entirely based on and originate with claims made in the Bible. If you recall, the mission inherent in this movie is to prove that the Bible accurately depicts a series of historical accounts. Kurt seems to be saying that he's abandoned that mission altogether, and, instead, will use the as-yet unproven historicity of the Bible as evidence in favor of a batch of other hypotheses.
So we slide into the third epoch of time, what I call the antediluvian period, the period before the flood and after the fall of man. It's a world that's different than the present. It's got the same natural laws going on, but it's a different set of critters, different set of plants. It's a little bit warmer Earth. The continents are in different positions from what they are now. It looks significantly different.
Chief? Kurt, there's no evidence whatsoever for a global flood. In fact, there's quite a bit of evidence against. As mentioned in a previous episode, there were thriving cultures that went about their daily lives and apparently took no notice of any potential global extinction level events during the time period you specify. That being the case, any mention of conditions before or after make no sense whatsoever.
Well, that's what we see in Peter, where it talks about that world being destroyed. So the flood was not just soaking everything. This was radical change, wasn't it?
Yeah, if we're right about what we've understood so far, we got continents moving, smashing together, creating mountains. Mountains are rising to tens of thousands of feet. You've got water washing across entire continents. We're ripping thousands of feet of sediment off of the old continents and then depositing thousands of feet of sediment on top of them again. We're looking at earthquakes of astonishing power.
Or it could have been plate tectonics. Of course, when I say could have been, I really mean was. All the major mountain ranges have been studied in detail. The plate movements that caused them have been mapped, and their histories have been worked out for millions of years in the past. The problem of mountain formation has been solved, and a flood had no part in the solution. Secondly, the catastrophic formation of mountains and subsequent return of the sea into its basin would have released tremendous amounts of heat and mechanical energy, enough to boil the oceans and metamorphose the minerals in those mountains. No trace of such a catastrophe exists. Formation of mountains during the flood also does not explain why different mountains are different ages. The Appalachians, for example, are much older than the Rockies, as one can immediately see just from how the two ranges are differently eroded.
So this change then from what you call the antediluvian epoch now into the post-flood.
Basically, the Earth has got to recover from a global flood. The atmosphere's got to recover, the geology, the rocks have to recover, plants and animals have to spread across the earth. You got lots of water, humongous earthquake, humongous volcanoes, and more or less that period of recovery is a slow decrease in intensity and frequency of those things.
So would it be in that period that we would see the Ice Age, for example?
Yes, that's ironically, the Ice Age turns out to be, in our modeling, a consequence of the heating of the water during the flood. Water is evaporating off the oceans. That cools the oceans. The water is then moving over the continents and dropping enormous volumes of water. Now, in certain places, the rain's going to come down as snow, but coming down so rapidly and without break that it can't melt and accumulates into thick sequences of ice until they're miles thick. And then when the oceans had cooled enough that that rain generation system had stopped, then those glaciers then collapse under their own weight, melt back to the current position, and they're continuing to melt. You know, this thing, global warming, it's recovering. The Earth is still recovering from the flood.
All right, the hypothesis you just heard from Kurt is beyond silly. Adding heat to a system makes it hotter. The falling moisture would have been a hot rain, not snow. Kurt invokes evaporation as a cooling method. He's forgotten that all the heat lost to evaporation returns when the water condenses again, so that more latent heat is then released in the freezing. An ice age cannot fit into his time scale. For a continent-scale glacier to form, advance enough to change the landscape, and retreat takes centuries or more, not a decade.
So that was really a fairly tumultuous era right then, but then you have one final epoch.
So the modern epoch is you can study present processes and understand things fairly readily back to within a couple centuries of the flood.
And so that would lead one to think that these processes, if you take them all the way back...
Precisely.
Right.
You take the present processes and extend them into the back. And that's what 2 Peter says. That's the error people make. It's reasonable. Take the present and extend it into the past. Not unreasonable. So you need to go to the Bible to find out the necessary information to reconstruct it. And looking at it the other way, if you start from the Bible, you only get the beginning of the story.
Right.
God has given us the ability to read the rocks and fill in the rest of the story. And we need to fully understand the flood. We start with the Bible, but then we go to the rocks. Speak to the rocks and they shall tell you what has happened in the past.
Kurt, you mentioned the rocks before and gave no information whatsoever about how the rocks confirm your hypotheses. Which, to be fair, are not really your hypotheses, are they? They're the same fairy tales that creationists have been spewing for years. Nice work pretending that they were all your ideas, though. If I heard your babble correctly, you seem to state that present-day processes would have been in effect starting a few hundred years after the alleged flood. If you've listened to the pug like a good creationist, you now understand that all of the geologic activity you described could not have occurred in just those few hundred years. In your closing, I see that once again, instead of trying to support the historicity of Genesis, you decided to skip that little step and use Genesis as the basis for all your hypotheses. Isn't it wonderful how if you start with a conclusion, it's really easy to create a fanciful fairy tale of reality, as you've done. Bravo!
Although in our last segment, Dr. Kurt Wise admitted to Dell that the story told in Genesis is completely invisible in the evidence we find in nature.
And we wouldn't have come to that conclusion if we didn't have the Word of God.
Dell is unfazed and decides to visit possibly the most famous paleontologist of all time, Dr. Ross.
A paleontologist who works out. You're like Indiana Jones.
I am like Indiana Jones.
No, sorry to get your hopes up once again. Dell visited Dr. Marcus Ross, a paleontologist with a PhD.
Doctor? Oh, I didn't know he had a nickname.
Well, his PhD is in environmental science, not paleontology.
Sorry, you had a paleontologist on your face.
Unlike some of the other men in the film, according to Google Scholar, Ross has never published even a single paper in a peer-reviewed journal.
Oh yeah, don't get too worked up over it. I mean, it sounds like he's a doctor, but he's not.
His current job is an associate professor. Apparently the full professors were busy.
Were there any questions about paleontology?
In geology, not paleontology, at Liberty University, the Christian school founded by Jerry Falwell. Word is that President Trump will be giving the commencement speech there this year. But none of that is important. What's important is Marcus's ideas and evidence.
In this briefcase, I carry actual scientific facts. A briefcase of facts, if you will.
So let's see what he has for us. Dell and Marcus stroll through an empty natural history museum while complaining that natural history museums give people the wrong idea about history.
We're not alone.
Maybe they should have filmed this in Ken Ham's museum.
Yeah, fossils tend to be found in distinct layers where there are very, very large numbers that have been destroyed, untold billions. And so every time we see a layer of rock that's this thick, we're thinking about an event that probably took minutes to make, not thousands of years, minutes for just this one package of rock, sometimes even seconds.
It's a common straw man for creationists to perpetuate a misunderstanding that mainstream geologists think that sediment accumulated slowly, grain by grain. They don't. The rocks are billions of years old, but not because that's how long it took the sediment to accumulate. It is well known that some accumulations are slow and some are fast. Again, it's important for everyone to be clear that the rock age claims have to do with how long these layers have been sitting there, not how quickly or slowly they formed. But for Marcus to be so bold to assert that all layers were laid down in minutes and seconds is crazy. I went looking for any papers by Marcus, or anyone really, trying to back that up with evidence, but I couldn't find anything.
Of course, this is just conjecture.
That was an irresponsibly bold claim to make. The flood doesn't require seconds. Why overreach like that? I mean, in a segment before this, in this very film, Snelling takes great pains and screen minutes to describe mile after mile of thousands of individually formed sand dunes cross-bedding in the Grand Canyon. Now Ross will have to say that the Coconino sandstone layer would have had to have been deposited in minutes, meaning each of those diagonal dunes formed and collapsed in milliseconds somehow. So now these two PhDs completely contradict each other. Does anyone care?
So you're saying that we have these marine fossils all over, even on mountains?
I think Dell's question was trying to set him up for the typical creationist observation that we find clam cells on the top of mountain ranges. Somewhere along the way, Marcus must have picked up that even under flood geology, the mountain ranges are rocks that were pushed up from the depths of the ocean as plates collided, bringing the ocean fossils with them. Good for Marcus.
Yeah, further back over in the museum, they've got sections with things like mosasaurs, these big swimming reptiles. Mosasaurs are globally distributed, and they're distributed on continents. So looking at these things, you're saying, what is it that has the power? What is it that has the capacity to take the marine world and throw it on top of the continents in such a violent and destructive manner? And the flood makes perfect sense for this.
There's a field of science called paleogeography, where they study the ancient geography of the Earth's surface. The Earth's geography is constantly changing. Plate tectonic interactions move continents, mountain ranges are thrust upwards, and sea levels rise and fall. Believe it or not, these changes can be traced through the study of the rock and fossil record, and the massive amounts of data measured is used to create paleographic maps to demonstrate the changes. Now, the mosasaurs Marcus speaks of lived in the Cretaceous period. The mosasaurs become more popular of late with their appearance in Jurassic World. Unfortunately, the one in the movie was depicted twice as large as the largest fossil found, and about 3 times the size of the average one found. Still cool on screen, nevertheless. Most of the chalk layers in the world were laid down during the Cretaceous period, and these chalk-based limestone layers are found all over the Earth, as Marcus suggests. The other thing to know about the Cretaceous is that it marked the Earth's highest sea levels. Here's a map of the Earth as it looked in the Cretaceous. Notice the massive waterways crossing the continents. Just for fun, let's compare that to the exact map that Is Genesis History used to demonstrate the locations of mosasaur fossil finds. So, does a conventional paradigm need to come up with a reason why huge marine creatures were thrown on top of the continents? No, they were buried where they swam. Nothing so dramatic needed.
I don't know squat about dinosaurs.
It's important to point out that most young Earth geologists believe in, and in fact rely upon, continental drift to account for flood geology. They just think it happened underwater in the course of a year. So be careful which parts of this you want to dismiss.
And then once we start getting to those nice sedimentary rocks that have all the wonderful fossils in them, the pattern starts to emerge.
Oh, good. Another dinosaur story.
The ecosystem that has the first animals in it shows up very suddenly. In conventional paleontology, they call this the Cambrian explosion.
Ah, yes, the unfortunately named Cambrian explosion. Now, the Cambrian was a period of time about 543 million years ago. It is part of the Paleozoic era and is predated by the Neoproterozoic era. It's the explosion part that creationists love to latch onto, because it sounds like one of those 24-hour days from Genesis 1. However, the Cambrian period is generally defined as a 55 million year period. This explosion was 55 million years in the making. And Marcus slips a fib into his intro when he says that the Cambrian is the ecosystem with the first animals in it. Sites like Xinjiang, China have fossil records of multicellular animal life at least 30 million years before the start of the Cambrian.
It's the first appearance of a wide diversity of different types of marine animals.
Good for Marcus for admitting that the Cambrian was marine animals only. I've seen some attempts to deliberately mislead to the idea that all of the modern creatures we know today emerged in this little window. But there are no starfish, crabs, insects, fish, lizards, birds, or mammals of any kind in the Cambrian. In reality, it's just a handful of phyla body types in their most primitive form. For example, vertebrates are part of the chordata group, characterized by a nerve cord, gill pouches, and a notochord. In the Cambrian, we first see fossils of soft-bodied creatures with these very limited basic characteristics. Of course, vertebrates appeared much later, and the body plans we see in the Cambrian have none of the defining features we recognize today. Some may want to say that the marine nature of the Cambrian affirms that Genesis speaks of water life before land life. But that is difficult to reconcile an exclusively marine fossil record with just a single 24-hour period in which no creature died because Eve hadn't sinned yet. Plus, birds were also said to be created on day 5 with the fish, and they don't appear in the fossil record until the very last stages.
Hey, everybody! Remember that thing that's been dead for a gazillion years? Well, here's a little bone we didn't know it had.
All of a sudden, you have this complex and whole ecosystem that shows up basically out of nowhere.
Did it show up out of nowhere, or basically out of nowhere? As mentioned, we have at least 30 million years of multicelled animal life prior to the Cambrian, which is amazing when you think of the requirements for fossilization. Of course, it makes sense that there are a lot more fossils once bodies began to develop features like bones and shells, but we know where the Cambrian animals came from. And Marcus keeps emphasizing that the ecosystem is whole. He's attempting to play on the common misconception that evolution should somehow produce partial animals in transition, and extrapolating that false idea over to an ecosystem. What would a partial ecosystem even look like? Do you think evolution proposes that natural selection would include creatures that have nothing to eat?
Instead, you see an explosion of life that is complex, whole, the ecosystem is integrated with one another, you can see where all the different organisms fit with respect to one another, and that's just the first time that happens.
Wait, that's just the first time that happens? Are you trying to say there were multiple creation events?
Every time you move up in the geological column, in this fossil record, you start seeing snapshots of more and more ecosystems.
Wait, rewind that.
Every time you move up in the geological column, in this fossil record...
Did a creationist just admit that the geological column is a real thing?
Now you got to understand the geologic column is the Bible for the evolutionists, okay? And it can only be found one place in the entire world. One place in the whole world you can find the geologic column. Guess where it's at? Right here in the textbooks. That is the only place in the entire world you can find the geologic column. It doesn't exist.
Fascinating. But carry on.
You've got one ecosystem that's destroyed, and then you've got another one. It's got slightly different creatures, there's different interactions going on, and as the floodwaters move higher and higher, they're getting closer and closer to shore, destroying more and more organisms in the shoreline and eventually up onto land. Where these pulses of water from the flood are moving over the continents, grabbing ecosystems or dragging marine ones up from deeper in the ocean and pulling them onto land. And as one gets deposited and the waves come back, they start pulling and piling additional stuff on top of that. And it's a graveyard on top of a graveyard on top of a graveyard.
Okay, so let's see if we can figure out Ross's story here. The film acknowledges the Cambrian, Ordovician, Silurian, Devonian, Carboniferous, Permian, Triassic, Jurassic, Cretaceous, who were apparently living in that order as isolated ecosystems from shore to inland. So the floodwater grabs the Cambrian ecosystem, but if the water dragged it onto shore, then it also would have mixed with the other ecosystems. So he must have meant that the water lifted it up in the air and jumped the others and dropped it in the middle. Then the waves receded and grabbed the Ordovician, jumped that in the air, and dumped it on the Cambrian. Then the Silurian. Then the Devonian. Yikes, this is getting tall. Then the Carboniferous. Then the Permian. Then the Triassic. Then the Jurassic. Finally, the Cretaceous. Sheesh, that doesn't even include any layers of mammals yet. I wonder where they went, because there are no mammals under these layers, not even a mouse. What about the fact that these layers are worldwide and not in isolated stacks? Is this a credible hypothesis to anyone?
None of my questions have anything to do with paleontology.
This is a pattern that we see in several different groups where their footprints are first and their body parts are later. For the trilobites, for the amphibians, for the dinosaurs, the first time I find evidence of them in the fossil record, it's from trackways, not hard parts. From an old Earth perspective, that's really weird and hard to grapple with because you have millions of years between the trackway production and ultimately the animal that made it. But that obviously doesn't make a whole lot of sense. Right? Because if there's trackways, there's animals, and those animals have bones and teeth and shells to them. Why aren't they fossilized?
Once again, I'm at a complete loss as to how this is supposed to be evidence of anything at all. We know that fossilization is a rare occurrence, and of those rare fossils that exist, we found only some. So Marcus points out 3 examples of trackway fossils that are older than the oldest corresponding body fossils. Let me give this a try. There are 5 million year old saber-toothed tiger fossils, but the oldest tracks from saber-toothed tigers are from just 50,000 years ago. For the woolly mammoth, the fossils are 400,000 years old, where the oldest tracks are just 40,000 years old. So here are 3 examples that are exact opposite of Marcus's examples. And there are tens of thousands of species where no tracks have ever been found. What has any of this proved about the age of anything? Literally nothing. Except maybe that the Earth has been a muddy place to walk all throughout its history, not just the day of the flood, however long you think that history may be.
But the fact that those trackways are still there, that should tell us something as well, shouldn't it?
One, it tells us that the deposition or the placement of the next layer on top of them had to happen very, very quickly. Because, again, you go out onto a beach and you walk in the sand, your trackways are destroyed very, very quickly.
Fossilized remains of plant and animal bodies are necessarily the result of rapid burial, where rapid is relative to happening more quickly than bodily decay or being eaten by scavengers. However, fossilized animal tracks, a subset of what are called trace fossils, are typically not formed by rapid burial, but rather gentle burying by sediments. Marcus invoked an image of footprints in wet sand, but there's nothing that can bury wet sand footprints fast enough to preserve them. Dense mud is best for preserving footprints, specifically in a period without rainfall. Indeed, we have examples of track beds featuring multiple animals where there was obviously days or weeks separating the newer and older tracks. A flood is actually the worst case scenario for any kind of track to be preserved. It's such a known problem that some creationists have gone so far as to suggest lulls during the flood to attempt to account for them. All this while, the previous segments of the film claim that the flood was so destructive that it formed the Grand Canyon in a few hours. Which is it, guys? That Marcus just straight up declares the complete opposite of demonstrable, observable, repeatable trace fossil preservation science shows just how little this movie thinks of its audience.
Yeah, I mean, before I didn't agree with you, but at least I respected you. That was fun.
We join Del Tackett and Arthur Chadwick, Ph.D. Arthur is a taphonomist. What the hell is a taphonomist, you ask? Well, a taphonomist studies the processes, such as burial, decay, and preservation, that affect animal and plant remains as they become fossilized. Let's see how this specialization helps Arthur understand the history represented by fossils found in the Lance Formation in Wyoming.
If the dinosaurs had died suddenly in the flood, wouldn't it be obvious?
I'm not sure I'm thrilled to hear that reference to the flood, as proving the historicity of the Genesis account is supposed to be the goal of this creationist film. This could be construed as a form of the red herring logical fallacy, as the alleged occurrence of the flood is really what needs to be proven here. The phrase, "if the dinosaurs had died suddenly," is the distraction, or red herring in this case.
What we're dealing with here, this is in the Lance Formation. This is a Upper Cretaceous sedimentary deposit.
Arthur mentions the Cretaceous period here. Oddly enough, he fails to mention the apparent contradiction. The Cretaceous is a geologic period that spans 79 million years, from the end of the Jurassic period, 145 million years ago, to the beginning of the Paleogene period, 66 million years ago. Both Arthur and Dell believe the Earth to be around 6,000 years old. Guess he forgot.
And what we have here is what's called a bone bed. It's an accumulation of bones that's about 1 meter thick, a little less than 1 meter. And in this meter, we find the bones present as a graded bed with little bones at the top and bigger bones at the bottom.
Interesting description of the dig at the Lance Formation. You can bet, however, that Arthur is going to revisit this graded bed issue, as it's a commonly used creationist argument.
what is mainly different about the sites that you're digging here as opposed to what we would say a general dinosaur dig somewhere?
Well, there are dinosaurs found all over the world, but this particular site is unique in that it's probably one of the largest collections of bones in the world. And there are the remains of I'd say between 5,000 and 10,000 animals, each 20 to 40 feet long in this deposit. These are big animals, and there are a lot of them.
That's a very interesting detail. I bet we could learn a lot from all those fossils.
Let's step back for just a second. Okay, so we had a duck-bill dinosaur roaming around the earth, and all of a sudden it dies. Would it become a fossil?
Fossilization requires very special circumstances. Normally, we know, for example, if a coyote dies out in the desert, its body is soon gone. Yet these bones are all perfectly preserved.
Not if they're fossilized, they aren't. The original bone is long gone. Fossils are formed in a number of different ways. Most are formed when a plant or animal dies in a watery environment and is buried in mud and silt. Soft tissues quickly decompose, leaving the hard bones or shells behind. Over time, sediment builds up over the top and hardens into rock. As the encased bones decay, minerals seep in, replacing the organic material cell by cell in a process called petrification.
They have never been subjected to weather.
Assertion without evidence.
They are just all there. Today it would be very difficult to imagine how you could do that.
You heard that, right? The taphonomist says he has no idea how fossilization occurs. And what's with the inclusion of the word today? Does he not realize that today, right now, an antelope bone may be starting the long fossilization process somewhere?
These animals had to die, and then their carcasses had to have time to rot. So we're talking days or weeks or months, during which time the bones and tissues were either eaten away or rotted away. And then the bones that remained were deposited instantaneously in this environment because they're in a graded bed with big bones at the bottom and little bones at the top. And you can see that here. The big bones are all down at the bottom. And when they start digging up here, they start to find smaller bones. So that condition requires a sorting process that can only take place during a catastrophic emplacement.
Remember when he mentioned the graded bed earlier, and I said he'd be getting back to it? Well, here it is. Both of these guys are trying to say that since all these fossils are located together and in a graded bed, the entire site can be considered evidence for a global flood, which is what they're referring to when they say catastrophic emplacement and catastrophe. Unfortunately, for a global flood to be correct, all fossils from all species of living thing would need to be found in the same layer of Earth whenever the global flood occurred. That means you should be able to find a human skeleton next to a dinosaur's. This has never been the case. Ever.
The dinosaurs are already dinosaurs when they first appear. They look just like anyone would think a dinosaur looked. And this is an enigma for those who believe in the evolution of the dinosaurs.
It would only be enigmatic if the premise, dinosaurs were already dinosaurs when they first appeared, was in any way accurate. It isn't. At least not in the way Arthur wants it to be. Of course anything called a dinosaur was a dinosaur from birth to death. But that's not what he means. Listen to their next exchange and you'll see what I mean.
But we hear a lot about transitional forms. What's the real story there?
Scientists have been able to lay out some forms they think are transitional, and some of them are very interesting, some even challenging. But they are the exceptions to the rule. The rule is there are no transitional fossils, and what we find in the fossil record, and contra to Darwin's hopes.
Darwin's hoax? Is he serious? Darwin certainly got the ball rolling, but he died in 1882. Since then, continuous research and refinement of the theory of evolution has resulted in one of the most well-supported theories in the history of science. It is falsifiable, and yet, in all that time, has not been falsified. Even if Darwin had perpetrated a hoax, all research since his death has only strengthened the theory. As for his no transitional fossils, only willful ignorance would allow one to make such a statement. One very robust chain of transitional species we have is the Equus, the horse. Oh, since the topic seems to be dinosaurs, we've got those too. So yes, there are no transitional fossils, except for all the transitional fossils.
This is the rule, is that a form exists in the fossil record, it basically stays unchanged, and it disappears from the fossil record without having been changed. That's got to mean something besides evolution, because we don't ever see changes from this form into this form in the rocks themselves.
That has to be either blatant dishonesty, or head in the sand ignorance. Do I need to bring the picture back up? We actually have a huge number of transitional fossils and links between species. While it's true that we won't be able to find every single fossil for every single species that has ever existed, we have more than enough to accept the fossil record as extremely important evidence for evolution.
So it's coming from somewhere else. It's a paradigm that's being imposed on the data rather than the data providing the paradigm. So I think it's very easy for me to be a creationist just based on my understanding of the complexity of life forms. And when we look at the fossil record, we can see that complexity is all there from the beginning, and this begs the question of where did all this complexity come from?
Paradigm being imposed on the data? I find it hypocritical that someone who starts with the firm belief that the Bible is 100% factually accurate and then tries to shoehorn any and all data in compliance with that presupposition would make such a statement. As for complexity being there since the beginning, perhaps Arthur would like to discuss relatively simple Precambrian life form. Probably not, though.
It's one thing to have faith. I have faith that God was the creator, but that's substantiated by what I see around me. To say I have faith that evolution produced this when I can't even see how it could have happened, that's blind faith.
Well, there it is. First, an admission that he's starting with the creator presupposition and admitting only data that supports that presupposition. Earlier in this video, we've seen examples of ignoring conflicting data, such as transitional species. Secondly, he states, I can't even see how it could have happened. The classic argument from incredulity.
That's a leap in the dark.
That's a leap in the dark.
That's actually a pretty funny statement coming from two people who want to drag us back into the Dark Ages.
Trailing away from Chadwick's bone bed, Dell enters what is easily the least picturesque venue in the film, the lab of one Kevin Anderson, who the film tells us is a PhD microbiologist. Kevin and Dell got all tactile with some visually squishy blob that came out of a triceratops horn, with some assertions and appeals to common sense that squishy things have to be new.
So that has to have shaken up the scientific community. What's been the response of all of this?
The initial response, when Dr. Schweitzer first published her work, which is what became very popularized in 2005, it generated a lot of response.
The Dr. Schweitzer Kevin speaks of is Dr. Mary Schweitzer, the paleontologist who made these initial findings and who authored or co-authored most of the popular papers to come out of this dinosaur soft tissue research. Now, some of you may know that earlier this year I had the incredible pleasure of being in a hangout with Dr. Schweitzer.
Morning.
Now, Dr. Schweitzer wanted to get something on the record in regards to her personal faith.
I am a Christian. I love the Lord. My God has gotten so much bigger the bigger I study science.
Wow. Seems like Dr. Schweitzer would have been the perfect person to interview for this movie.
And I don't want to waste time on other issues like how old is the Earth. I mean, really, who cares?
Oh, I see.
You had a lot of proposals of what it could be. And to her credit, Dr. Schweitzer did more work.
Okay, Kevin, if you accept Mary as the leader in this field, then let's go back to the beginning.
The Hell Creek Formation in Montana, which is a very popular place for finding dinosaur bones, and we instead dug out a almost 4-foot-long Triceratops brow horn. Pieces such as this, we have found tissue with cells.
I've been reading about dinosaur soft tissue a lot this year, and these first claims are immediate red flags. You heard him. Kevin says he found cells. Let's take a look at Kevin's published peer-reviewed paper on this finding. Refreshingly, there is such a thing. His results speak of microstructures consistent with cellular organelles, spherical cell-like structures, intracellular organelle-like structures, red blood cell-like microstructures, microstructures resembling cellular organelles, and so on. On film, Kevin says he found cells. In his paper, he claims only cell-like structures. Now, I'm not disputing that what Kevin is looking at are preserved remains of cells, just like what he dug out of the ground was the preserved remains of a horn. I'm being picky about this because they are not currently cells, and that misrepresentation is what Kevin is trying to make the audience believe, because he's going to proceed to argue that this is an argument for young bones. But is this an important distinction? I had a chance to ask Dr. Schweitzer.
So I was recently at a Young Earth seminar where your research was used to support claims that working blood vessels, fresh blood cells, and intact DNA had been found in dinosaur fossils. Is that a fair characterization of your research?
It's wrong on all counts. It depends on how you define it. And that's what I mean. Words are really, really important. Do we have blood cells? No, we do not have blood cells. I don't have the data to support that. We have round red structures that localize to the blood vessel channels. They have the morphological characteristics of blood vessels. They have a chemical makeup similar to what you'd expect blood cells to have.
Okay, so there are no actual cells, just remains. And once you're at that point of cellular remains, preservation is mere intellectual curiosity about the method, not a paradigm-altering reality, which Kevin obviously knows because he adds,
Oh, that's amazing.
And potentially proteins such as collagen.
If he thought he had actual cells, which are necessarily made of protein, then he wouldn't weaken it with potentially proteins, which are necessary if any of his young bone claims are to make any sense. With the word protein, most of the audience will think of something like a steak from a butcher shop. But the example Kevin gives us is collagen.
Right. So with collagen, for example, it has this really unique advantage in that it is tightly complex to mineral. And mineral, it has a great stabilizing effect on biomolecules. So in the process of bone formation, the collagen is laid down by the bone cells, and then it is subsequently mineralized. And that mineral collagen association gives stability to both. Part of the way that collagen degrades is it expands. And if it's completely housed in bone, it can't. So you have a lot of different things coming together that contribute to the preservation of collagen. And then collagen is a real robust molecule. It's kind of hangs out for a long time under normal circumstances. So in bone, it's orders of magnitude more lasting.
It's so difficult to understand.
Indeed. But difficult to understand is not a measurement of truth. Sometimes the universe is simple, but many of the most amazing and useful things science has learned is not only counterintuitive, but so difficult to understand. And yet they are true. Bouncing text messages to the computer in your pocket, curing diseases, solving crimes, and, yes, telling us true things about the past. Difficult to understand is not a measure of anything.
How you could have this material still in a dinosaur fossil that is supposed to be 65, 75, 80 million years of age, because tissue, cells, proteins break down.
They do, which is why I took the time to point out that you didn't find any tissue cells or intact protein. You found preserved remains of these things, which is what fossils are.
They tend to break down fairly quickly depending upon the conditions. And certainly in Hell Creek, the conditions would be warm up, cool down, warm up, cool down. And any biochemist can tell you that is the fastest way to destroy material.
All right, Hell's Creek. That's actually where Dr. Schweitzer does her research. Anything to say about Hell's Creek, Mary?
If you look at Hell Creek formation age or Hell Creek formation dating, Judith River formation, you'll see the papers, the geology behind why they say what they say. So the Hell Creek is about the last 3 million years of the age of the dinosaurs. It is deposited during a time when the Mesozoic ends and the Paleozoic begins. So it is divided from the later sediments by the KT boundary, which in Montana is spectacularly visible in the parts of the country that we look at. You can go up and put your finger on it. It's kind of cool.
Now, some people would claim, well, it means nothing because we know how old they are, and therefore it just means it survived somehow, big deal.
Yes, exactly. And the cool thing of it is, if we quit wasting time on how old these things are and start getting at why are they there, it has huge implications that go far beyond dinosaurs. And that's what kind of drives me is, okay, so these things persist in dinosaur bone. How come? What can we learn from that?
But how do you know how old they are?
It's well documented, and I don't need to reinvent the wheel. But it can be dated in a couple different ways. The most common way for dinosaur-bearing sediments to be dated is what we call relative dating. A relative dating is grounded by absolute dating if you have any kind of volcanic activity. So where I work, there's a lot of mountain building activity at the time of the dinosaurs. So we do have schemes of volcanic material and ash that can be dated absolutely. So we use absolute dating to bracket the youngest and oldest potential times for the sediments that bear our fossils, and then we use relative dating techniques within that bracket to figure out exactly where it lies.
Well, it's all the paradigm drives your conclusions.
When I wear my science hat, I don't have beliefs. I have only data. It's very boring. Data can only do two things. It can either support or fail to support.
The paradigm is it has to be old. Therefore, methods that give us an old fossil are what we choose.
But in the end, if my data is good enough, if my data are rigorous enough, if my data are repeatable enough, they can have their minds changed. And that is science. It isn't faith. That's science.
Absolutely.
When I wear my science hat, I don't have beliefs. I have only data.
At least to me, and of course, I'm not a microbiologist.
No, you are not. Are you about to make a claim that would best come from a microbiologist? Are you going to say, but there you go.
I think most people would say, well, that just seems reasonable.
One can discuss the pros and cons of a democratic process in any given situation, but truth and science are never determined by what most people would say is reasonable, often the opposite.
To think that maybe these are not that old.
Clearly, this is in violation of the dating process.
That bugs me. Why would God try to trick us? It's like, okay, we're going to give you a brain and we're going to make a world of order, because order is something God's known for. He's rational. He's consistent. So we're going to make this world of order, and then, wow, we're going to trick you by saying that all the rules that you can figure out with your brain no longer apply. I don't buy that. God's not the deceiver in this. And I think that young earth creationists have to be really, really careful when they sit there and try to manipulate the data to support their worldview. That is not science.
If the fossils of dinosaurs have been dated incorrectly, which I would say this is clear evidence they have.
It's not this big cloudy mystery that scientists are just sitting in their lab trying to figure out how to confuse and I don't know, destroy Christian faith. I am a Christian. I love the Lord. And I have absolutely, my God has gotten so much bigger the bigger I study science. I mean, it's really, really, and I don't want to waste time on other issues like how old is the earth.
What you're saying is that if you pull out the notion of a long period of time, you're pulling out a major foundation for the conventional paradigm.
If these guys would take half the energy that they spend trying to prove that the world is young and use it to change the world around them, feed the hungry, take care of the kids, get the cats off the street, anything, that our world would be so much better. But they waste so much time and energy and effort on disproving that the world is old. It's not a salvation issue. You know, for it.
What else is there for me to say? Thanks, Mary.
Today we're going to be visiting with Del Tackett and Robert Carter, PhD in marine biology. Let's see what they have to say.
So from your perspective as a marine biologist, and I know that you've studied the whole area of genetics a lot.
Yes.
When people talk about evolution, what is it?
Evolution is quite simply the change in genetic composition of a population over successive generations, which may be caused by natural selection, inbreeding, hybridization, or mutation. Now, let's see how Dr. Carter defines it.
How do you define evolution? The word means change over time. But I believe in change over time, but I'm not an evolutionist. So how does one figure this out? Really, evolution is a belief that enough change over time, over enough time, can lead to the common ancestry of all species on Earth.
And the distortions start already. Evolution is not a belief. Evolution is a fact. It has occurred.
All right.
So that's the part I reject. Of course species change. I mean, look at these sharks here. We have several different species of sharks. When God created, He put into those organisms the ability to change, to adapt, to respond dynamically to the environment. But they're still sharks. And when we look at the fossil record, they're still sharks.
Of course they're still sharks, just as humans are still apes. If they were not, the theory of evolution would be falsified.
Yeah, people have heard the phrase the missing link, and they usually think of between man and monkeys. No, there's missing links between almost every major group of animal and almost every other major group of animal and plant, even bacteria, throughout the entire fossil record.
People may have heard the phrase the missing, but it's hardly useful in the study of the theory of evolution. The term transitional form or transitional species is much more useful and accurate. Transitional forms occur between what was and what is, and have characteristics of both. Unfortunately, no matter how many transitional forms we collect from the fossil record, the creationist will always demand one more.
But no one has found the missing link between ape and the so-called Homo habilis.
Yes, they have! It's called Australopithecus africanus!
Oh, I've got you now. Fair enough. But where, then, is the missing link between apes and this Darwinius Macellai? Answer me that, Professor.
Which indicates very strongly that these are actually different creations.
So we don't get one kind becoming another kind.
No.
This is just a repetition of their dogs don't become cats argument using different words. The creationists know very well that the theory of evolution does not claim that dogs will become cats or one kind will become another kind. If this ever did happen, once again, the theory of evolution would be falsified.
Evolutionary theory requires that small, random changes can explain everything we see.
Mm-hmm.
But it can't.
And why can't it?
Because life is so complex that small changes can't explain it. Just like you can't take a computer operating system and look at it and say, oh yeah, this is built up one digit at a time over any length of time. No, it took an intelligent person to sit down and put it together.
Well, I can guarantee you, as one who was in that world, that if anyone in the area of computer science were to say, if we just randomly change some things in this operating system, it'll get better, I mean, no one would agree with that.
No.
Wow. Two problems in that last exchange. First, the argument that a long series of small changes cannot result in complexity is asserted without evidence. Second, a false analogy is employed in that a life form or DNA molecule cannot be compared to a computer program or operating system. If a segment of a functional computer program is disabled, the program will experience an exception or fault, whereas there are many segments of a DNA strand that are permanently disabled. Another flaw in this false analogy is that biological evolution occurs in populations, not individuals. Randomly changing the operating system of a computer affects a population size of 1.
We're not going to get the shark to evolve into a bird. That the number of changes and the types of changes are not something that you can do one change at a time.
Sharks to birds? This is just another restatement of the dogs to cats or one kind to another kind straw man argument.
You would never know it until you studied really hard that this also is an echinoderm. He's not very happy being out of the water, so let me put him back in.
Yeah, so these are all related, even though they look very, very different.
Come on, Del. Make the leap. Recognize common ancestry.
Related in their creation.
Ah, shit.
Not in an evolutionary sense, but our creator took this phylum of life, the echinoderms, and created this and this and this on a similar pattern. And that's what we see across the entire realm of life, similarities and differences.
Oh? I thought that the kinds on the fictional ark speciated like lightning into the variety of related land animals we see today. So that is all true, but for related sea animals, completely different. Why is your story good for sea cucumbers, but not for the finches? Guys, you don't even have internal consistency in your arguments.
So what makes them different?
Well, genetically, they share most of their genes in common. But there are developmental genes, they're called Hox genes, that set up these patterns in the animal as it develops. They develop from a single cell. In one of them, they set up a 5-fold symmetry. Another, they set up a 10-fold symmetry. Another one, they make this long, skinny animal. They control the development of the embryo in these amazing ways.
So what you're saying, when we look at this from a molecular or genetic perspective, what we're finding is really a fascinating design in all of it.
Well, he is trying to argue for design. He's doing a pretty poor job.
Absolutely.
Glad you agree, Rob.
But what we've heard in the conventional paradigm, the conventional story tells us that it's those random changes that has brought about all of this.
Sure. Back in the 1800s, when life was simple, when they didn't know what was happening inside the cell, they didn't know how complex genetics was, you could imagine all sorts of things. But now that we know what actually happens behind the scenes, the story gets a lot more complicated. You see, I like to say the genome is 4-dimensional.
Okay, I'm going to summarize the next segment for all of you, because it's basically word salad. I'll provide a link to Carter's paper on the subject in the description. In an attempt to dumb it down for his target audience, basically inane paper becomes incomprehensible. You heard him say that he likes to say that the genome is 4-dimensional. Wait till you hear what those dimensions are. Dimension 1, all the letters corresponding to the base pairs in the DNA strand, written out. Dimension 2, a bunch of arrows between various sections of the series of written letters. This is because different parts of the DNA strand work in concert with other parts, or activate or deactivate other parts. At this point, Dell makes another false analogy to a computer program, one that rewrites itself. DNA is not a computer program, and it's certainly not rewriting itself. Dimension 3, the folding of the genome into a 3-dimensional form. Dimension 4, time. I kid you not. This is what he said. This is an accurate description of his 4 dimensions as stated in a full, single-spaced page of Babel.
Rob, that's so far beyond anything that we know, even in our most complex software systems, that it's almost beyond imagination to think that someone would look at that and say it all happened by chance.
That's a tough one. I'm not sure if that's an argument from ignorance or an argument from incredulity. Definitely one of those two, though.
Yes, and it only brings glory to God.
It does.
You can't build something like that up one thing at a time. Yeah. You need it to function. In all this interlocking 4-dimensional complexity, it's not something you can do one letter at a time with natural selection.
Mm-hmm. It all has to be there.
This sounds like the old irreducible complexity argument. Of what use is half an eye, they say. I say go ask a flatworm. They have the most primitive eyes I know of. It's just 2 light-sensitive patches on their head.
Yeah, in the same way when we talked about the environment out here on the coral reef, if you don't have all these interlocking pieces of that puzzle, you don't have that ecology. The system will come crashing down if you just remove a couple of very important factors that are there. They have to be together or it doesn't happen.
Making reference to the reef now. I guess when they scuttle a ship to form an artificial reef, they dump in all the life forms, fish, crustaceans, bacteria that live on an existing reef. Sounds like they're saying it all has to show up on day 1, or day 5, depending on your choice of magic book.
It's clear that the world we live in is incredibly interdependent, from the smallest biological system to the largest ecosystem. There are complex mutual relationships everywhere. I realize that creation in 6 days makes the most sense from an engineering perspective. You need everything working together at the same time for everything to function properly. And that's exactly how Genesis says God created it.
Well, there it is. Good old Dell has expanded the long-debunked irreducible complexity argument to include the entire Earth.
Rob also said God created animals with the ability to change and adapt to their environments. Is it possible this ability to change has been mistaken for evolution?
Okay, look, Dell, I feel a little sorry for you, so how's this sound? We don't have a 100% solid theory for abiogenesis yet. So, if it'll make you feel better, you're allowed to believe that your invisible man in the sky gave that ability to change to a few newly created single-celled life forms about 3.8 billion years ago. Deal? That way everybody's happy.
It was time for Dell to move on from Dr. Carter's marine world of ugly sea urchins and cucumbers and find creatures more appealing, more fuzzy.
As Todd Wood and I walked through the zoo, we saw incredible beauty and amazing design wherever we looked.
As a biologist, what do you see when you see all of these creatures?
As always, it's nice to have a little background on Dell's PhD guests. Dr. Charles Todd Wood is a graduate of Liberty University, which has gained some fame of late by having President Trump give the commencement address there. But in our circles, Liberty University is well known for being one of the only places on Earth you can earn a biology degree in young Earth creationism.
Being an outsider is fine. Embrace the label.
Now, Todd has secular peer review under his belt as well, including a well-cited paper on the genome of race. But he's become best known as Dr. Bearmanology, an unofficial title that probably got him into the film.
Yeah, when I look at this, look at these lions specifically, I'm seeing cats myself. And all the other cats they have here at the zoo, they all have this underlying catness to them that's really apparent.
They're just like a cat.
They look like a cat. You know, scientists would put that into a family called Felidae. And I would understand the felids to be representatives of a single created kind. So the continuity, the similarity there is so significant that I'd say, yeah, these guys have all descended from a single pair of critters that was on the ark, and that eventually generated all the different sorts of cats that we have today.
And underlying catness, that's really apparent. What unit of measurement do you suppose we use for apparency? Are we talking like 130 apparenticitors of catness? That's not very scientific language for someone who's adopted an intended to sound like science title like baraminology. I tried to find footage of Todd explaining the concept with his own words, so as not to misrepresent, but the closest was Dennis Wirt presenting one of Todd's papers, using direct quotes from Todd.
We're going to use a paper by Mr. Baraminology, Dr. Charles Todd Wood. What is baraminology? How did it come about? Where did it start?
Behrman, where have I heard that before?
A comic book. It stars Jimmy Halpert, a mild-mannered paper salesman who, while riding his bike through the forest, is bitten by a radioactive bear. Becomes Bear Man.
Bear Man?
Wreaks havoc on the office. It's really good.
Cool. But probably unrelated. Pity. Carry on.
The idea of a barraman, that word barraman, comes from the word bara, which means to create, and min means kind. It was a term that was first created for the created kind. It was based on a very basic kind of a priori assumption, and that is that biological organisms were created in their kinds by God in the creation week. And then afterwards, they diversified very, very quickly over a short period of time, interrupted by a catastrophe known as Noah's flood.
So give me some other examples of created kinds.
Yeah, so you've got the grizzlies and the polar bear. Those are all members of the bear kind. You've got ducks, swans, and geese.
Why does any discussion of created kinds feel like an episode of Sesame Street? Are we playing one of these things as not like the other?
And now it's time to play our game. It's time to play our game.
Better than examples, could you perhaps define created kind? In terms of definitional ambiguity paired with frequency of use, created kind is right up there with mind and spirit and soul. According to Answers in Genesis,
despite all this variety, it's easy to see which of these belong in the same group. Modern scientists call each of these groups families.
But then they walk this back, saying, there's no reason to assume a one-to-one correspondence between our man-made system and the biblical terminology, so kind may be at a higher taxonomic level in some cases and lower in others. So higher, lower, or the same. That's a pretty useless definition. The Institute for Creation Research admits they don't have one either, but asks that its supporters pray for future, presuppositional research inquiry into the definition of the biblical term kind. It's almost like creationists don't want their word to mean anything. What does Todd say?
An unambiguous criterion for what a barraman is would make research a lot easier.
Right.
Because of these problems, creation biologists today approximate the limits of a barraman using a suite of characteristics. It has organisms that share all the continuity among themselves and are completely discontinuous with all other organisms. And that is the original kind.
Okay, so we already heard Todd talk about continuity in the context of the cat kind example. Let's remember that word discontinuity for later. This definition is obviously fuzzy to the extreme and totally ad hoc, but I give Todd credit for at least attempting it.
It appears as if all of these different species are coming from a really elaborate design.
Oh, absolutely. And it's not just a design like God, designed and created the lion. It's God created something that could make a lion. Mm-hmm. So it's more like, a multi-tool or a Swiss Army knife where you got all these pieces that you can just pop out whenever you need them, but it's all just one thing.
Big cats are one thing, but Dell wanted to know about humans, so they went to the gorilla cage and Todd showed his reverence for history and science by pulling priceless hominid skulls out of his flimsy blue backpack.
Ooh, a skull.
So this guy is a Neanderthal, very, very low forehead, so we have really tall foreheads, but at the same time, well, it looks very human. We have others that are very different. Australopithecus africanus.
The species of the famous Lucy fossil.
What do you do with this stuff? I mean, there's many more that we could show, many more pictures, many more skulls, and you can see, looking at them together, there's a lot of difference there.
Yeah.
Well, here's the thing. So all that created kind stuff that we already talked about, I can show that I can find a discontinuity between humans and non-humans.
There's that discontinuity word again.
So this thing lands on the human side. This Neanderthal here, it's one of us. This thing is not. It is different. But this would be just another one of those varieties of living things that God made in the beginning and that survived the flood aboard the ark.
Yeesh, I'd never actually thought of hominids like Lucy being aboard the ark. Why is that extra disturbing? Todd's paper on the modern Barrowman concept defines discontinuity as a significant, holistic difference between two organisms. And here I was worried it might be vague or arbitrary.
All we see are variations that happen within a created kind. So there's a felid tree, which has all the cats on it. There's the canid tree, which has all the dogs on it. There's the ursid tree, which has all the bears on it. There's the equid tree with all the horses on it. Each individual created kind, then, has its own individual tree, so that you end up with something like an orchard or a forest.
All right, so the identification of created kinds involves grouping with obvious similarities and separating by obvious differences, and the premise that God pre-programmed all the variation potential into the original pairs of each kind. Now, if you might indulge me for a minute for an honest question about this process, could we consider the extinct miacids, which had features and proto-similarities to the dogs, cats, and bears? Is it possible that instead of these kinds shown, God made a miacid kind, and that he pre-programmed the variations of dogs, cats, and bears into the one pair of miacids on the ark? Is this any different a claim? It's possible, right? And if it's possible there was a miacid kind that included dogs, cats, and bears, is it possible there was just a mammal kind? That God made a single pair of mammals that he pre-programmed with all the variations to become dogs and cats and bears and mice and rabbits and horses? Surely God could have just as easily done that too, right? Not impossible for a designer God. Well, what if on day 6 God made just a single pair of land-dwelling animals, but in them had pre-programmed all the genetic potential to specialize into reptiles, amphibians, and mammals? Or maybe God made just a single cell of life that he pre-programmed with all the diversity to become plants and animals. That'd be possible for God, right? And aligned with all the available physical evidence. I think we've all just become theistic evolutionists.
Well, Todd, that's kind of fascinating now to think about what God was doing when he was bringing two of every kind. What do you think was going on there?
Ah, yes, Noah's Ark. The obvious question of how could millions of species of land animals fit on the ark is the only reason this Barrowman idea exists in the first place.
He doesn't have to bring every little variety onto the ark. So when you actually do the calculations, and okay, so we don't know exactly how many created kinds there were on the ark, but maybe a couple thousands, and they're small. Most animals are quite small, so you have room to spare, literally room to spare. And all of that diversity that we have today is built into those two of every kind.
So 7,000 pairs became all the species we know today. The velocity of this diversity is something Bill Nye addressed in his debate with Ken Ham.
Let's see, if there are 4,000 years since Ken Ham's flood, and let's say, as he said many times, there are 7,000 kinds today, so we'll take a number which I think is pretty reasonable, 16 million species today. We would expect to find 11 new species every day. So you'd go out into your yard, you wouldn't just find a different bird, a new bird, you'd find a different kind of bird, a whole new species of bird every day.
But in another interview, Todd points out that the velocity problem is far worse than even Bill presents.
How is it that they're able to come about so fast? Why is it that very soon after the flood, Abraham is owning cattle and donkeys and camels? Those are modern species, modern domesticated species, and yet he's got them within 400 years of the flood. That's an amazing rate of production of species. And my suspicion is that there's an initial burst and a burst of speciation, a burst of new species, and then it sort of dies off after that. And we need to understand how that is.
See, this velocity problem doesn't bother Todd at all, even at a rate of 110 new species per day. He leans right into it, disregarding gestation periods and litter sizes. Such a proposed species explosion would obviously require supernatural intervention, so there's no reason for any physical restraints to apply.
How does the standard story, the conventional paradigm, explain all of that?
Well, they would use evolution, right? So millions of years, random variations. We all go back to a common ancestor that lived billions of years ago. And through the process of mutation and genetic variation and natural selection, that's where we get the stuff that we have today. And that's exactly what we observe.
I'm sorry. Did you just admit that evolution from common descent is exactly what we observe?
Now, don't get me wrong. I mean, natural selection and random variation can do amazing things. I mean, it's pretty astonishing.
You acknowledge mutation and natural selection, Todd? And that was a remarkably coherent description of evolution for a young Earth presentation. Are you sure you're in the right film?
Created kinds with bunnies. And so 2 of those go on the ark. The rest of them are destroyed in the flood. And then, of course, God says again to be fruitful and multiply and fill the earth. And so there are now bunnies reproducing again. And guess what? As they do that, there's some varieties of bunnies that are generated at that point. All 54 things that we call species today would have come from 2 bunnies that lived and survived the flood aboard Noah's Ark. Now you might be thinking, hey, that sounds a lot like evolution, right? I mean, they're all evolving from a common ancestor. So isn't that just evolution?
Maybe Todd's personal blog will shed some light. Here we go, Todd's blog and the truth about evolution. Let's see what he says. Evolution is not a theory in crisis. It is not teetering on the verge of collapse. It has not failed as a scientific explanation. There is evidence for evolution, gobs and gobs of it. It is not just speculation or a faith choice or an assumption or a religion. It is a productive framework for lots of biological research, and it has amazing explanatory power. There is no conspiracy to hide the truth about the failure of evolution. There has really been no failure of evolution as a scientific theory. It works, and it works well. I'm confused, Todd. If evolution is such successful science, why all of this created kinds business? Again, from Todd's personal blog, it is my own faith choice to reject evolution, because I believe the Bible reveals true information about the history of the earth that is fundamentally incompatible with evolution. I am motivated to understand God's creation from what I believe to be a biblical creationist perspective. Evolution itself is not flawed or without evidence. Please don't be duped into thinking that somehow evolution itself is a failure. Faith is enough. If God said it, that should settle it. Maybe that's not enough for your scoffing professor or your non-Christian friends, but it should be enough for you. So, as we once again ask, is Genesis history science? The very expert Dell puts on screen says no. No, it's not science. In Todd's expert opinion, evolution has the evidence, and the Genesis position is arrived at only by faith. If the man on screen says it so clearly, what else is left for me to add?
In this episode, Del Tackett is joined by Danny Faulkner, PhD. Let's see what they have to say, shall we?
It was a beautiful night. Danny took me far outside the city and kept me up very late in order to show me something I will never forget.
Is it just me, or did that sound a little creepy?
Oh my goodness, now you're gonna make me buy a telescope.
You know, we have some purposes given for the stars in Genesis 1:14-19. That's the day 4 creation account. It mentions the stars and other heavenly bodies to mark time, to rule over the night, to be for signs, seasons, festivals, and so forth.
Well, it looks like Danny's starting out a little early this episode. He's already using the Bible, specifically Genesis, as the authority, when, as you all recall, the purpose of the original movie was to demonstrate the veracity of the Bible and Genesis specifically.
People have been using the stars for marking passage of time. The patterns repeat every night. They repeat every year. They come back in their season. There's a lot of regularity going on here.
What about the design of the sun and the moon?
I heard you sneak the word design in there, Del.
Well, there are a couple of things I can talk about. On rare occasions, the moon passes between us and the sun. Doesn't happen very often. And when that happens, the moon just barely covers the sun up. If the moon were a little smaller or a little farther away, it wouldn't do it at all. If it were larger or closer to us, it would be grossly over total. And so these eclipses are spectacular and rare, and this is the only planet on which it matters, and it's the only planet on which it happens.
Okay, so the argument you're making here is if things were different, things would be different. And let me guess, you're going to pull some deep meaning from that.
And you've got to think either just that's the way the world is for no apparent reason, or the world is that way for a purpose and design. And to me, that speaks of creation.
Did I call it?
Okay, high overhead here we have the Great Square of Pegasus. It's this big rectangle. Now coming off of Pegasus is a little fuzzy spot right there. Do you see that?
Yes.
That's the Andromeda Galaxy. That is the most distant object that you can see with the naked eye. It's we think a little over 2 million light years away, and it contains a couple 100 billion stars.
Wow. Ooh, I know where this is going. 2 million light years away. We can see it. Speed of light is a constant. That means the universe can be no younger than 2 million years. This is going to be great. We're going to get an explanation for this. Can't wait.
Okay, Danny, that brings me to a big question, and a big question in a lot of people's minds. If we have stars that are that far away, millions of light years away, and if the Earth is young, as we believe, then how in the world can the starlight be here?
Here it comes. We're finally going to get an answer.
We call this the light travel time problem. And I'll try to phrase it for you a little differently. We believe that the creation is only thousands of years old, say 6,000 years, 7,000 years, something like that. And I've just pointed out something to you that we think is 2 million light years away from us. I think those distances are reasonably correct. And we creationists need to answer this question, and we've offered several different solutions to that. I'll discuss with you my solution on this.
Here it comes.
Several things jump out at me in the creation account. One, there was a lot of process going on, very rapid process, but still process. If you look at the day 3 account, it talks about plants rising up out of the ground. It says, let the earth bring forth these plants, and the earth brought forth. I think if you would have been there, it would have looked like a time-lapse movie. Growth that might take normally decades taking place in a matter of minutes or hours at the most. Normal growth abnormally fast. I believe you can interpret one day of creation in terms of another day. So I turn to the day 4 account. Not much information is given there, but I think God also rapidly made the stars and other astronomical bodies. And then in order for them to fulfill their function to be seen, he had to rapidly bring forth that light, just as he brought plants and matured them quickly. He had to bring that light here.
Wait, what now? That's your answer? God brought the light? Why didn't you just say magic? That's a dumb answer, and here's why it's dumb. Let's say your God created stars all zippity quick, and those stars started creating light. So your God snatched up that instant of light and brought it here. Has it occurred to you that we would only see that one instant of light? The next instant of light would still be 2 million years away from us, with nothing but darkness in between. Your God would have to shuttle back and forth for 2 million years, bringing light until the natural flow of light reached us. That's significantly longer than would be possible in your 6,000-year-old universe.
I'm suggesting when we actually look at these objects, like the Andromeda Galaxy we saw a few minutes ago, we're looking at light that actually left that object.
Yes.
So I think there's a rapid maturing took place.
Rapid maturing? What's that got to do with your God bringing the light?
Danny, are there some other things that you see that would point to a young universe?
I think so. For instance, spiral galaxies. The Andromeda Galaxy we talked about is a spiral galaxy. Our own is. And the inside of the galaxies should spin faster than the outside of the galaxy. So after a few rotations, you ought to wind up or smear out those spiral patterns. They ought to disappear after a few rotations. Now, most astronomers think that spiral galaxies are 10 billion years old. So why do we still see spiral patterns? You shouldn't see those.
Right.
And it's been long recognized as a problem.
I see Danny is thinking that the arms of spiral galaxies are trailing out from the center, just as the swirling spiral atop a recently stirred coffee. That's not the case. Spiral arms are density waves, which travel through the galaxy's disk, causing a piling up of stars and gas at the crests of each wave. Do we have any indication that this explanation is correct? Oddly enough, we do. Spiral galaxy NGC 4622 tends to indicate just that. In 2002, a Hubble Space Telescope image suggested that the outer spiral arms of the galaxy NGC 4622 pointed in the same direction as the galaxy's rotation, unlike any previously known galaxy. This could not be the case if Danny's coffee swirl understanding of galaxies were correct.
But also, if we look at the outer planets of the solar system, the gas giants, they all have rings. And we also know that these things are changing. They're wiping out. They've actually documented changes that have taken place within the ring system. You have all these gravitational tugs from the other satellites orbiting around. So these ring systems are fairly young. Doesn't prove the solar system is young, but it proves that these ring systems are young. And that's interesting.
That entire last paragraph from Danny Boy can be safely ignored. he freely admits that the age of the rings has precisely dick to do with the age of the solar system, and hence the universe.
It brings us to what most people see as the big theory concerning cosmology and the universe, and that's the Big Bang. How do you see that? Is it holding up over time?
I don't think so. I think it's getting some problems. So much so that more than a dozen years ago, I think in the New Scientist magazine, there was an open letter protesting the Big Bang Theory, and it's had hundreds of signatories since, and most of the people signing it are atheists.
What difference would atheism make? Science is utterly unconcerned with the supernatural, so a person's religious affiliation, or lack thereof, doesn't come into it.
This idea that the Big Bang model is universally accepted is not true. There are many people out there, well-known people, very famous physics and astronomy people that have real problems with the Big Bang. And
indeed, the universe may have existed forever, according to a model that applies quantum correction terms to complement Einstein's theory of general relativity. The model may also account for dark matter and dark energy, resolving multiple problems at once. This, however, does nothing to accomplish the stated goal of the Is Genesis History movie. The goal is not to disprove the Big Bang, but to demonstrate that Genesis is history. No evidence has been presented so far in this episode that supports the Genesis fable.
And I don't see any way that you can reconcile Big Bang with the Bible.
Why should anything need to be reconciled with the Bible, or Harry Potter for that matter?
Though a lot of people seem to think that you can. I think the temptation they have there is to try to interpret Scripture in terms of the current cosmological thinking. That's nothing new. That's happened before, as it's turned out, with disastrous results. So I think when you look at the history of science, the way we've discarded theories over time, you've had theories that were supposedly beyond dispute and then later on discarded. When you see that lesson from history and then you want to wed Genesis, you want to interpret Genesis in terms of the ruling paradigm, I think you need to be very careful.
That's how science works. When new information becomes available, existing theories may need to be updated or discarded. That's how science continually improves. And why are you talking about interpreting Scripture? You're supposed to be demonstrating that Genesis is history.
I realized Danny was reorienting our perspective. We need to interpret the universe in terms of Genesis, not the other way around. And Genesis tells us that God created the sun, moon, and stars to be a magnificent clock to track the passage of time. Even the ancients built towers to follow the stars.
Well, there's the wrap-up. Nowhere in this episode was there even the slightest shred of evidence that Genesis is, in fact, history. All we've gotten is assertions of biblical authority, like we just heard from Dell.
While we all felt that Dell and Danny's special night of stargazing together could go on forever, the film's parade of PhDs had to continue to the Oriental Institute Museum and archaeologist Douglas Petrovic.
So this picks up these events we've been looking at in Genesis, from creation and the flood, and now we're to the dispersion of mankind out of Noah and his family.
Exactly. And the dispersion would have taken place somewhere in this mountain range to the northwest of Mesopotamia.
Why not use the name, the Mountains of Ararat? Most Bible enthusiasts would recognize that from the Noah story. People are less bored when they hear things they recognize. Less bored, at least.
And what we see in the biblical text in the narrative is that a number of people have migrated down to southern Mesopotamia, the land of Shinar.
I can tell already that this segment is going to be largely devoid of scientific claims. So if I put on my biblical exegesis hat for a minute, I'd point out that Genesis 11:1 says that the people moved eastward to Shinar. And you just said they went south to Shinar. I understand you may have reasons for this, but you're speaking in a film that says that strictly literal interpretation of Genesis 1 and 2 is the only possible correct interpretation, with all others being false. I'm curious why a more flexible interpretation is okay for the latter chapters. For the record, ministries like Answers in Genesis completely disagree that Shinar or the Tower of Babel was in the south, so even young Earth creation camps are in disagreement about this point. And therefore all the speculation we're about to hear.
And that's the famous Tower of Babel.
Absolutely.
It's not so absolutely for other believers, but I'm just here for the science.
Do we know where that is?
There are about 7 or 8 Babels, cities of Babel, in the ancient area of Mesopotamia. And so one at a time, I've studied all of those areas and found only one that meets all the criteria of the famous site of the Tower of Babel, and that is the site of Eridu, which is in southeastern Mesopotamia. We have signs of the expansion to the north, to the south, to the east, to the west, all the way as far as Egypt.
Okay, so basically he's saying there are civilizations in all directions from the spot he picked. But what about this spot? Or this spot? Or this spot? They all seem to work. Is his proposed Babel site some kind of obvious epicenter, or is it totally arbitrary? But don't worry, this is an archaeologist. I'm sure he'll show us evidence.
And when you say evidence, that is the artifacts that we find in these archaeological digs?
Exactly. There's an enormous amount and very specific kinds of material culture that attest to this expansion of people that I'm connecting to the post-Babel dispersion. Here are the bevel rim bowls, these two.
These bevel rim bowls are an interesting phenomenon. The precision uniformity of shape and size across tens of thousands of these bowl finds, coupled with the relative difficulty to achieve this specific shape by hand, leads archaeologists to point to these bowls as possibly the earliest mass-produced product that we know of. There's even some evidence that these bowls were used as currency. Archaeological consensus agrees that these bowls originated in Uruk, so if we accept Douglas's assessment of the Babel location, then this seems consistent. That said, the bowls were mass-produced in and around Uruk. The dispersal of the bowls fits patterns of trade, rather than indicators that the manufacturing spread throughout the world. Doesn't quite fit the confusion scenario.
And because we see language, or the written expression of language, just pop up out of nowhere.
I'm not sure what pop up out of nowhere means to Douglas. Certainly the earliest examples of writing are the earliest examples of writing. Just like earlier in the film, when Dr. Ross tried to pretend that life appeared suddenly in the Cambrian, he selectively ignored all the more basal life forms from eras earlier than the Cambrian. It seems Douglas is ignoring all the archaeological finds known as proto-writing. These man-made markings use symbols and patterns for numbers and ideas, even though they didn't have a formal syntax. Examples found in graves in China date back to 7000 BC, before Dell thinks the Earth was created, as are the Vinca signs in Serbia from 6000 BC, and the Despilio tablet from Greece.
And then different languages being represented through cuneiform script or through hieroglyphic script or other means. So you do not have a universal plan that's followed among all of the languages. You see great diversity in the forms of grammar from language to language, even in ancient languages.
This is great stuff. I could make a career out of this guy. You see how clever this part is? How it doesn't require a shred of proof? And most paranoid delusions are intricate, but this is brilliant.
This is part of what makes stories like the Tower of Babel entirely non-falsifiable in the Genesis literalist mind. Any evidence that cultures influenced each other, like the beveled bowls, is seen as pre-tower commonality. Any evidence that cultures developed independently of each other, like very different language features, is seen as the hand of God confusing things.
So all of this fits perfectly with what we would see as the biblical account.
If something's the same, it fits. If something's different, it fits. Easy. I guess I could be a biblical archaeologist after all.
Of how languages took place. It's really the only way of explaining this.
It's the only way of explaining it? How about modern language splits and formation like Italian, German, French, Spanish, and English? Did God cause a second Tower of Babel event in Europe this millennium? Or was it just geographic diversity, separation, and cross-pollination with travel and trade?
So the integrity of biblical history ultimately is justified by the expression of these languages.
Provided that you ignore the ancient proto-writing samples, maybe you could find justification. You'd also need to assume that civilizations like the Chinese, Egyptians, and Mayans were pre-flood, then got interrupted by the flood, and then went right on back to the same language, cities, and cultures without mentioning the pesky flood interruption.
Now, most of us think today of a tower, the kinds of things we see in big cities, big straight walls. Is that what they were building?
Is that what they were building? Is a very well-worded question from Dell. This will allow Doug to speak factually about ancient Middle East structures, and it will sound like they can be attributed to the story of Babel. When we think about Atlantis, we think about bubbles and domes and technology. What kind of structures were they building in 1600 BC? That's the same thing.
Well, essentially it's a variation of a pyramid, and there were 4 sides to it and several stairways that would go up to the top.
It's called the ziggurat. I'm really confused by your unwillingness to throw out jargon.
At Eridu, we have a temple that existed in 18 different phases, and in every phase it grew in its size and its complexity. And that final temple, that final phase of the temple, it was abandoned immediately, right at the time of the late Uruk expansion.
There are innumerable reasons why a building project might be abandoned in any century. A miraculous intervention by God isn't exactly necessary for this kind of mundane happening. But incomplete structure would be a necessary marker for an actual Tower of Babel, so good for you.
Catacorner to the temple was an absolutely enormous platform.
Do you think that could be the foundation of the Tower of Babel?
Absolutely.
Wait, why is this absolutely?
You keep using the word. I don't think it means what you think it means.
You were just talking about an 18-phase ziggurat that halted completion. That was pretty close to the original story. Why are we moving over to the empty lot next door? Genesis 11 says nothing about a second tower. If you're looking to affirm the story, what about the handful of details we do get? Brick instead of stone and tar for mortar. If the building materials match, tell us, Doug. That would be a great confirming detail. Verse 8 says they stopped building the city. Not just the tower, but stopped building the city. Are there other incomplete structures in the city? That'd be corroboration. And that would mean that there are no structures in the city newer than the incomplete tower, right? Does that match your findings, Doug? Again, that would be corroboration. I have no idea what this empty pad is supposed to tell us.
Absolutely. We can move forward to the time of Abraham because we know that Abraham lived at the site of Ur, which was also in southern Mesopotamia, at the end of the 3rd millennium BC.
That brings us to the end of Genesis chapter 11.
Exactly. In fact, you see some pottery, some cuneiform tablets, all dating to the period of the 3rd dynasty of Ur.
Okay. You're just showing us things that existed in the approximate time and place that the story of Abraham took place, right? None of these things actually corroborate any element of the Abraham story.
It's amazing just as we're sitting here thinking about that, thinking about Abraham and that this represents the culture and the civilization that he lived in. It's a great tie to that record in Genesis.
Okay, let me repeat that for you. We know that Sherlock Holmes lived in London in the 1890s. Here you have a pipe and a newspaper dating to that time. It's amazing thinking about Sherlock Holmes and that this represents the culture he lived in. It's a great tie to that record in the novels. We know that Spider-Man lived in New York in the 1960s. Here you have a Mickey Mantle baseball card and a tie-dye shirt dating from that time. It's amazing thinking about Spider-Man and that this represents the culture he lived in. It's a great tie to that record in the comic books.
It is fascinating, and it gives you a feeling of putting your hands around the events that go on in the biblical text.
The events in the biblical text? I didn't hear anything affirming any Genesis events. We heard about some bowls, written languages that looked different from each other, one structure that may or may not have been unfinished, and pottery that happened to exist at the same time a story was written. That's it. There were very few science claims in this segment, but the historian didn't really even present history.
In this exciting episode of Is Genesis History Science? We'll be looking in on Dell and George Grant. George Grant is a PhD and a pastor, sort of a PhD pastor. Anyway, let's get on with it.
So there's something significant about the Genesis text in which Adam and Eve are then placed into a garden to tend it. That's more than just a story.
Oh, I see we're off to a great start. Dell, you've been reminded before, the name of your film is Genesis History. You can't just assert that it's more than a story. You have to demonstrate that it is history.
It's much more than just a story.
Assertion without evidence.
One of the things that you see in Genesis chapter 1 is the structure for time. The universe is created for a 24-hour day.
What? What do you mean the universe is created for a 24-hour day? Rotational period of our planet, Earth, is 24 hours, but there are no other planets in our solar system with a rotational period of 24 hours. There are no planets with orbits of 24. No. The universe does not care about a 24-hour day.
And so everything from the way our sleep cycles and the way our work cycles work all come from that definitive historical account there.
Okay, once again, you are showing that Genesis is history by claiming that Genesis is history.
When we get to Genesis chapter 2, we start to see the meaning and purpose of man.
Running around naked in a garden, eating fruits and veggies. Sounds fulfilling.
Of course, in Genesis chapter 3, we see the disruption of everything by the fall. And the implications of an historical fall, an actual man and an actual woman who actually yielded to actual sin, have then implications all through the rest of the Bible.
You're actually annoying the crap out of me, George.
If you remove a literal Adam and Eve, that changes the whole shape of what history is and how history is remembered.
Sneaky. I was just implying that the Bible is history. But at least we see why Genesis is so important to these folks. Later Bible fables are contingent upon the Adam and Eve fable. So you see what George is doing here is replacing the word fable with the word history.
Is that because when we pull an Adam and Eve out of a historical record, we can then pretty much make up what we think about man and marriage and even sexuality?
Ooh, it looks like we're wedging in some of that good old creationist bigotry there. Still, even that being the case, I find this sentence to be basically a non sequitur.
Absolutely. The Apostle Paul understood the events of the early chapters of Genesis as formative, not only for our understanding of history, but for relationships between men and women and their children, the character and nature of marriage, rightness and wrongness in moral relations, including sexuality. All of that is assumed from those early chapters of Genesis, oftentimes quoting the passages verbatim.
And apparently it was necessary to repeat the earlier bigotry, just in case anyone missed it. Additionally, it appears that the Apostle Paul was well versed in the earlier fables. This also lends no credibility to those earlier fables.
It seems that even Peter is taking that event of the flood, for example, as a historical event and laying it in the context of what he's pointing to, a judgment that will come. So even judgment is a part of understanding that historical record.
Okay, so Peter knew the stories too, and you've yet to produce a single shred of evidence that Genesis is actual history.
You cut things off from history, and you lose sight of the meaning of all of it.
Well, I guess it's a damn good thing that what we're talking about here is unsubstantiated stories as opposed to actual history.
I think most Christians, when we talk about, for example, the life of Christ, those are understood to be historical accounts.
Well, you may be right about what most Christians think. Unfortunately, there's not a whole lot of evidence to corroborate that story either.
Why is it that when we look at the account in Genesis that we have a tendency not to want to do that?
We have a tendency not to do it because we're constantly exhorted to not see it that way.
From the culture around us?
The culture around us.
Or it might be because Genesis is full of scientific impossibilities. We know, for example, that a global flood never happened. Additionally, modern genetics tells us that Homo sapiens never experienced a population bottleneck smaller than 10,000. 10,000, by the way, is more than 2. So the Adam and Eve thing also goes out the window.
From theologians, modern theologians who are trying to somehow, in their minds, fit the truths of Scripture with the so-called discoveries of science.
Controlled electricity, the space program, medicine, life-saving vaccines. Shut up, anti-vaxxers.
Which, if you know anything about the history of science, you know is an incredibly unreliable path.
I suspect that by unreliable, George means changes as new information becomes available, as opposed to the religious texts that are assumed to be perfect and unchanging.
So we're constantly bombarded with this message that we have to adjust our view.
Accept reality might be a better way to put that.
But I think there are a lot of Christians who have a sense that the historicity of Genesis is just not that important to their Christianity.
I think we've been sold a bill of goods on that. When you somehow make those chapters a different category altogether and non-historical, what are you doing to all of the rest of the Bible? The Bible that assumes that it's true, the Bible that treats it as historically true, the Bible that refers back to all of the characters that are there. Does that then negate the whole of the Bible? Well, yes. And that's exactly what the strategy was of the higher critics in the 18th and 19th centuries. They knew If you could somehow attack the first 3 or the first 11 chapters of Genesis, you've done away with the whole thing.
Well, there we have it. The creationists are terrified of the domino effect. Disprove Adam, no original sin. Salvation is not needed. The disturbing part here is that this last rant by George seems to indicate that scientific discovery and learning about the real world in general to be avoided at all costs. Seems the path back to the Dark Ages is a short one indeed.
Well, George, all of this brings us back then to the notion that the history that's recorded in Genesis, or any true history at all, is critical for us in terms of understanding what's going on around us.
Yeah, in fact, it reminds us of how important history is in anchoring all of the other human disciplines. It is history that helps to inform science, so that science can begin its journey of discovery in the world. So what history does is it tells us what happened. Then what science attempts to do is it asks the question, well, how did it happen? And then it begins to explore the how, the mechanics, the structures that were present in those events. If you try and reverse that, if you try and make science saying what actually happened, then you wind up having a worldview that is constantly shifting, where nothing is certain. And moral relativism is the necessary outcome.
Remember that when they say history, they really mean biblical stories. So what George is saying here is that the Bible tells us what happened. It can't be wrong, and it can't be changed. The only job of science is to describe for us how these static, unchanging biblical stories happen. Does anyone else see anything wrong with this?
And God has given us that bedrock. He's given us that foundation in that historical record.
He's given it to us in that historical record, going all the way back to Genesis chapter 1 and the garden.
Right up till the end, just keep repeating the word history.
We've been a lot of places and seen a lot of things, but considering everything together, it's clear that nothing in the world makes sense except in the light of Genesis.
Except, of course, for the billions of years age of the universe, verifiable by many different means, the common ancestry of all life on Earth, the fact that the sun is older than plants, ancient societies unaware of floods and language towers, the impossibility of genetic bottlenecking to a pair of single humans, and so on, and so on, and so on.
Everything that we have done up to this point has looked at the evidence that shows us that the Word of God, the history that has been laid down for us in Genesis, is true.
I think what you meant to say was, if you first assume Genesis is true in your own particular literalistic interpretation, then selective analysis will reinforce this conclusion, a process we call begging the question.
God created the world in 6 days. There is a real Adam, a real Eve. There is a real fall. There was a real flood that destroyed the world and produced all of this.
No, those are stories, like you might see in a movie.
It is glorious, but it represents the judgment of God. Everything supports what God has told us. Genesis is history, true history.
I think this is the most painful video I've encountered so far. Anyway, that's about it for this episode. Thanks for joining us. We'll see you next time.
Bring on the pug.